Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone. Today is September 11, 2021, and 9/11 is always a somber day, and perhaps given this particular occasion that we're in right now, it intensifies the sense of somberness as we reflect back upon this day. So today's event is entitled 9/11, 20 years later. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from today's event description. As we mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we'll take a look back at how our society and the world have fundamentally changed in wake of this fateful day. Rather than engaging in wild conspiracy theories about the orchestration of the attacks on American soil, and let me just pause right there because there are many groups dedicated to exploring this very topic. And that's all fine and good, but that's not what we do here in this group. We usually don't dwell on conspiracy theories. And what we're going to do instead today is to look at the policy responses in the wake of 9/11 and some of the political forces that brought about those responses as a US policy. So anyway, instead of engaging conspiracy theories, we're going to instead focus on the US response in the wake of 9/11. In doing so, we'll evaluate how the so-called global war on terror has shaped the geopolitics of the Middle East region, as well as a fundamental shift in America's foreign policy objectives for the past 2 decades. We'll also look at how the passage of the USA Patriot Act and the subsequent re-authorizations has fundamentally curbed the protections guaranteed under our Constitution. The following topics will be discussed, and perhaps most importantly, on a personal note, what is your memory of September 11th, 2001? How has this personally affected your lives from that day on? The next topic, how did 9/11 traumatized the American psyche in the ensuing years? Was America more united or divided in the years following 9/11? Next, what are the lessons learned from 9/11? Conversely, what were the mistakes made from 9/11? In looking back, do you agree with or support the public consensus of mass hysteria, of fear of terror advanced by the media and our public officials? Next, do you agree with or support the massively sweeping and overbroad expansion of powers and programs enacted by the government, namely the USA Patriot Act, the FISA warrantless surveillance, and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security? Was the over-militarization of our society justified? Next, do you agree with or support the sudden change in the US foreign policy objectives of preemptive strikes and the so-called exporting democracy abroad in the name of global war on terror? And finally, how can the US prevent another attack on American soil in the future? More importantly, how can America avoid another national tragedy that will inevitably result in another mass hysteria that will result in all of us to tacitly succumb to the expedited expansion of government powers? So there's plenty to talk about there. But I guess since we're looking back on this day on a personal note, why don't we start off with the first question, which is, what are your memories of September 11th, 2001? I'm sure many of us, perhaps most of us, were alive and probably have some direct memories, perhaps, of what that day was like. If you were living in New York City, let us know what that day was like for you. Perhaps you're living in the Washington, D.C. area because the Pentagon was also struck. Or if you were not living in either of these 2 areas, but you're living somewhere else, how did you first find out about what happened on 9/11 and what was that day like for you? So we have a small group so far. So instead of going into the breakout room, perhaps all of us just chime in by using the hand raising feature and just feel free to share your recollection of 9/11. You know, we're kind of looking at this from like you know, historical perspective 2 decades later, and obviously your experiences will certainly contribute to what history of this moment will be like. So anyone want to just chime in and share with us your memories of what happened on 9/11? No one? Okay. Well, looks like we've got a pretty quiet audience today. All right. Oh, hold on one second. Like we've got 2 volunteers. Great. So why don't we first start off with Marty and then Ryan. So Marty.
Okay. Thank you. Since no one was volunteering, and I really didn't want to discuss per se the question that you raised, I'm kind of going to go in a little bit different direction. But I'll begin by saying, yeah, I was driving to work and I heard that a private, airplane struck the tower, that it was an accident, and that it was, like a Piper Cub, a small private plane. By the time I got to work, I saw everybody congregated around the TV in the break room. Nobody was doing their job, and saw what was going on, and had a real pit in my stomach, and then I don't remember the rest of the day very much, but just thinking that this is not the end of it. There's more to come, and where will they strike next, and how will we respond? And then once I learned, and I don't know if it was the same day or the following day, but once I learned it was done by Arab terrorists, being Jewish, I was worried, oh, this is going to come back to haunt Israel and Jews in general. And so that became my overwhelming concern at that point. And I want to use that, if I may, to segue into what was said during our last meeting by the last person who spoke. I remember who she was, but I won't mention her name because as far as I could tell, she's not here right now to defend herself. But what she said was that she was making the case why we shouldn't get involved in foreign affairs. And one example she gave was that the US entered World War II to save the Jews while there was racism in this country. Well, the second part of her comment, that there was racism in America, is obviously true, especially given our treatment of Japanese Americans. But to say that the US went to war to rescue the Jews, or the war is because of the Jews, is one of the oldest Jew-hating tropes around, or it's just total ignorance of world history. So I'm not going to go into why we went into World War II. Everybody knows it's Pearl Harbor, and then Germany declared war on us. But to the second point, I want to emphasize that the US didn't give a damn about the Jews. And I'll give a few examples of that. Beginning in the 1920s, the US...
sorry, Marty.
Yeah.
I appreciate the historical perspective. We will come back to that later. But for now, I just want to kind of open it up and have people share their direct experience on September 11th.
All right.
So thanks for that response. Now, just curious, did you, were you able to finish work that day, or did you go home early, or what was that day like for you?
No, we stayed and continued working. Some people wanted to just, stay glued to the TV, and our management seemed to allow it. And when some of us, and I was not in management, but I was still doing my job, and my job was like quality assurance. When you hear that this call might be this call will be recorded and reviewed or whatever. So I was on that team doing so I was sending out reports on how people are doing on their calls, and the feedback they were giving me. How dare you, do quality assurance on a day like today? And I said, hey, we're still getting paid to do our job. So we got a job to do. We're still getting paid, so we still got to do it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing your story, Marty. For those of you just joining us, we're just getting started, and the opening question is, what is your direct memory of September 11th, 2001? So feel free to share any kind of, personal experience, any anecdotal examples that you've heard, maybe through family or friends. So let's go to the next member. We have Ryan, then Amber. Go ahead, Ryan.
Thanks. Well, my memories of 9/11 was absolutely terrifying. I was actually born on the 2nd of May 2001, was actually the year was born. And just thinking about like the planes being hijacked, though, that it made my heart sank. And worried about the victims, though. Thought, oh my gosh, it's just horrible. And it still haunted me. I just thought, I just can't bear this anymore. It was absolutely horrible. Well, I just cannot believe that how many lives were just taken away just this horrendous matters. And I'd also like to say that we just got about, and the only way we can improve this, though, is by having like proper security around airports, because we're just like lacking on security. So my priority is that we should get like tougher security in most international airports to prevent this incident happening in the first place, and then we should have more understanding about how this attacks actually occurred.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Let's go to some other members. So we have Amber and then Katie.
Sorry, I had a hard time taking the mute button off. I'm probably dating myself here. On September 11th, it was my senior year in middle school. I remember that day we went to school as normal, and then we were told to go into the auditorium after first period. And we sat there for like a couple of minutes, probably like 30 minutes, and then they told us to go home. So I don't remember the exact age I was, but remember walking home, like my school was like a mile away from my house. Walking home, just normal day, like, oh, I got an early day out of school. This is really cool. And I get home and my mom is in tears and she's like surprised to see me. And apparently the school had let us all out of school and the parents they could get in contact with, they called. So she didn't get the call, or she was too busy on the phone to get the call. But when I got home, she was like, how are you home? What is going on? And I'm like, I don't know. School just let us out and everything. And she's like, I'm trying to call your aunt. And at the time, she didn't explain to me why, and she didn't let me see the TV or anything like that. My aunt worked in Trade Center 1. So she worked in one of the buildings in the American Express department. She was with American Express. And she had been calling around all day to find out where my aunt was, if she got to work on time, so she called her husband, her co-workers, her best friends. So that's probably why she didn't get the phone call that I was coming home. And eventually she sat me down in front of the TV and we watched the tower smoking. And I remember her just in tears and freaking out, and me just freaking out, because even though, it was unrealistic to me, because I, was like looking at a movie. It's just like, oh my God, there's like burning buildings on the TV. And I think about 3 hours later, we were able to get a call from my aunt. Coincidentally, she got into an argument with her husband and missed her ride share with her coworker. And so she wasn't able to make it into work on time, but her coworker while they were evacuating people. She didn't make it. And so my aunts had taken the train, and the trains had stopped, and they let them out in a just before the bridge to Manhattan. And so people were walking back over the bridge to get away from Manhattan, to walk back into Queens. And so that's why we couldn't reach her, because she was walking over the bridge. She was, in a state of shock. And when she got to a medical center, that's when she was able to call us back. So my every 9/11, we go with her to the cemetery to visit her co-worker, who was a really good friend of hers. And we have like a little, not a party, but get together with the family.
Hey, Amber, we have a very bad connection.
Sorry. All that to say, it traumatized my mom and my aunt a lot because it was so close. It was a close call. But for me, it's kind of like an out of body experience, thinking about my memories of it.
Okay, thanks, Amber, for sharing your story. Let's go to next, Katie, then Ramsey.
Can I make a comment on Ryan's comment, or is that not, should I wait for later?
If you want to do that, that's great. And also, if you have any, personal recollections of what happened on September 11th, 2001, feel free to share whatever you want to share with us.
I can share my experience looks like Ryan dropped off, but my comment to his comment was, he talked about airport security, which is all true, improving the security. But I did watch a lot of videos on it because I got a little bit obsessed with the situation. And the thing is that the terrorists are tactical too. They're not going to necessarily stay in the same medium to attack the next time. So if they're going for an airliner this time, they might not be going for an airliner next time. They might be going for a train. So they're gonna stay unpredictable. And then my memory of that day was, I didn't have a television. I was just watching my neighbor watch it, and then she was glued to the television all day. And I just remember I kept on stopping by her house to watch what was happening on TV.
Okay, thanks for sharing your story. I guess in terms of the tactical ways of how the perpetrators try to use airplanes, I mean, there's a reason why we cannot wear shoes on, when we first checked into the TSA line, because there was a shoe bomber. So they did try to use airplanes again after 9/11. There's also a reason why we cannot bring any fluids on the airplane, like, shampoo or any kind of cosmetics that have, significant amount of fluids, because those are the ingredients required to make some kind of homemade explosive. So there have been a number of incidents or threats after 9/11. Hopefully it doesn't happen again, but they have used the airplane to use as an instrumentality of attacks subsequent to 9/11. Okay, let's go with, we have Ramsey and then Tom. Hi, Ramsey.
Hey, Thomas. So, wow, like for me, my memory of 9/11 was, I was 9, and I was in, I think that would place me at least maybe in, I want to say fourth or fifth grade. Yeah, I think fifth grade actually. And I just remember in the morning, I was getting ready to go to school. And I think we were me and my parents were staying in our grandparents' house because we were actually moving houses. So we were staying with our grandparents for just a minute in the transition with my grandparents. Yeah, my grandparents. So I remember getting ready for school one day, and then I see on the news on the TV that's playing in my grandparents' living room footage of the towers going down. And I went to school, I didn't really even register what had happened. And so we were at school, and then in the first class, the teachers said, okay, well, something's happened. We need you all, we need you kids to come into the other room. So they herded us all into this other room, and they put on the TV and the news, and they just played the news of, like, the towers burning, and the situation that was unfolding at the Pentagon, and that, yeah. And then they obviously, called all of our parents to come pick us up. And yeah, that's basically what I really remember. It's just that, like, I didn't even, like, register what had really happened until much later. I'd say, like, it didn't even, like, really hit me until, like, years later, like that the magnitude of what had happened, because I was still just, like, a child at the time. So I had no grasp of, like, what a terrorist was. I had no grasp of, like, what people how like the response and the events that unfolded in the aftermath of 9/11, how much that really impacted people such as myself, and such as the whole country. So that's pretty much, like, my most fervent memory of 9/11, is just not really having a clue of, like, what was going on. So I'm done speaking.
Okay, thanks, Ramsey. We'll go to Tal and then Andrew next.
Hi. So I was actually living in Israel at the time. I was pretty young too. I think I was around 10 or 11. And I think for myself, 2001, 2000 were pretty hard years for Israel in terms of terrorism. So I think I didn't grasp the difference in the beginning. It just seemed similar to me in terms of being violence and bombing and everything. I just remember our moms, because because of the time difference, it was already afternoon where I was. So I was heading with my friends to dance class, and all of our moms started calling us, asking us to come home immediately, which seemed to make no sense to us in the beginning, just because we were so far away from what it was. But I think it was just a sense of hysteria everywhere, because no one knew what was going to happen. I know my grandmother did the same with my grandfather. She called him to come back from work immediately because no one knew what was going on. And I think as a kid, the first time, I don't think I understood it in terms of what it means globally or anything, but I think the Twin Tower for me, it just seemed like those things in the world that are stable. So I just thought it's something that's always going to be there. And then to have it all of a sudden disappear, I think it just shook the stability and how fragile everything is. And I think I was surprised to see, oh, so I'm never going to see that again. So this is never going to, so it just seemed like one of the first world shattering moments for me as a kid.
Okay, thanks, Tal, for sharing your story. Let's go to Andrew and then Steve.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I think with my experience with Amber and Ramsey, I was mostly in that category. I was somewhere in middle school, and I was completely oblivious during the situation. I didn't even know what was going on in school, or don't even have a real good recollection what was going on in school. I think during that time I was too busy playing video games. But all I know was I was on the bed, and there was some news talking about something going on in New York, and there was some buildings burning, and that's pretty much it. I didn't have too much of a recollection of how my parents had during the reaction, but I was completely oblivious during that time. All I know is that a current friend of mine said he was doing his tour guide work in the city, and apparently when they tried to leave, they couldn't, because of course there was a situation that happened. So he told me there was a lot of angry people during his group because they wanted to go back home. But yeah, with me, I was pretty oblivious during that time because I was a kid.
Thanks, Andrew. Steve. Hello.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't living in New York then. I was in Chicago, and I remember the strange thing was the apartment building I lived in. There was someone. He wasn't really a friend, but he lived a few doors down, and I'd met him a few times. And he was from Brooklyn. And I was heading off to where I had just heard the news on the local news radio station, and I didn't expect. I just happened to run into him as I was heading to the elevator. And I was the one who broke the news to him. It was very strange. He was from New York. All of his family was there, and he had just woken up and hadn't heard yet. So that was that was that was a little bit of that was a hard thing to tell. So, I mean, I thought I assumed he already had heard, and I just said, oh no, and he hadn't. I was the one who had to break the news to him. So that was a little bit of a challenge. Then I remembered there was a lot of fear, even though Chicago hadn't been targeted. It has a major financial center, a big stock exchange, and the Sears Tower was still the largest building in the world at that point. So there was a little bit of fear that we might be next or we would be hurt. And I did go to work, but of course we didn't stay very long. And I worked at the Newbury Library, which was not very far from the heart of downtown Chicago, which is Michigan Avenue, the Water Tower Place, Miracle Mile. And I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't go back home directly. I remember walking to the Water Tower area, which is usually packed full of tourists. And, it's not quite Times Square level, but it's usually very crowded. And it was completely empty. Everyone had gone home. There was nobody in any of the shops. It was very weird and eerie. And then I remember getting on the bus home, and there were maybe what would normally be a standing room only bus had about 5 or 6 people on it. And one of them was a sort of a homeless person who was clearly totally unaware of what was happening and really, oblivious to it. So it was a challenging time, but I do remember people's fears that, Chicago also had at the time the world's, the US's largest and busiest airport. So there was a lot of concern this could happen too. But of course, grief and what was happening to New York. I do have a lot of relatives here, and I spoke to them all the time, even before I lived here. And one of them, some of them lived in Staten Island, which is where a lot of the firefighters and police officers lived. And they told me about how many of their neighbors and people they knew had died, family members, friends and family members. My own family didn't work in the downtown area, but they knew a lot of people who did. And that was a very, difficult time.
Okay, thanks, Steve. If I could share my personal recollection, I was living in Seattle, Washington at the time. So by the time I found out about what happened, both towers had already collapsed. That day was a very strange day because, I believe I went through like a cycle of, sadness, confusion, denial, anger all over again throughout the day and for, probably the rest of the month. One interesting thing I do recall is that even before 9/11, there was the millennial bomber who got arrested right in Washington State. And I remember that very precisely because the millennial bomber was on his way from Canada to go to LAX to, I guess, detonate some, explosives. And they got caught in Port Washington Ferry, which is, I've been there many times to go to vacation, to go up to Victoria, Canada, which is in British Columbia. And I remember when that incident happened, I thought, wow, that's pretty crazy. And, if you think about all the times that you've been on the ferries and other modes of public transportation, it's pretty easy for these guys to just kind of sneak in and try to do what they did. So I think the arrest of the millennial bomber was in 99. And, I guess if you look back in retrospect, you did see signs of these kinds of activities even before September 11th, 2001. So we're all here on Meetup platform. And For some of you in this group, we've had the privilege of meeting the founder and the former CEO of Meetup, Scott Heffernan. We've been invited to the headquarters of Meetup in New York on many occasions. And every time when you meet him, he will always introduce you by saying that Meetup, the platform, is a creation of what happened on 9/11. I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but basically Scott was living in downtown, and when 9/11 happened, people, A, were not able to get through to each other because of the lack of, I guess, telephone and other internet services being disconnected. And number two, people were just very busy. You could live in the same building, but you didn't really know your neighbors or any of the people that work for the building. So he wanted to create a platform where people come together and do things like what we're doing right now. Although his original vision was more like a face-to-face, live meeting. So I guess one, silver lining from what happened on 9/11 is, this platform that Scott had created. So as I use that as an example, despite the horrors of what happened on September 11th, there was this feeling of national unity. I don't know if others sensed that at the time. I recall, President George W. Bush, his approval ratings, spiked from like 50% to like almost 90%. Does anyone else recall that very narrow window of time where there was like this kind of sense of let's all get together, forget the partisan politics, we're all, Americans, and let's try to do something for greater good? Does anyone recall that moment? Or no? Not so much. All right.
Well, I kind of do. I kind of remember that. I just remember. I just remember like that was mostly referenced like in TV and like film. I just remember like I remember specifically this like episode of Seventh Heaven, if anybody remembers that show, where it was very basically much like I want to say it was very like patriotic and very like we need to come together as Americans and put aside the differences. And like honestly, like that even now, that's something that I don't think would even happen now. If 9/11 happens today, I honestly can't say that would happen again because I feel like we've become very, very much polarized. Even like, look what happened with the coronavirus. Like it's sort of the same thing. A national tragedy happened and people couldn't put aside differences long enough to combat it.
Right. Okay, let's go to Steve next.
Yeah, I do remember that, and actually a similar thing to the meetup phenomenon when I was, before it had made it outside of New York, in Chicago, a person I knew suddenly started a social get-together group. We did mostly hiking in the Indiana dunes and went to dinner, and he specifically started that as a reaction to 9/11 and trying to rebuild community. So that was pretty widespread, perhaps. But also, I remember the world expressing sympathy and the temporary ratcheting down of political tensions between the two parties. But I mean, this may go off into another theme, but I think that was quickly manipulated into dragooning us into a war in Afghanistan, which people who normally oppose such things, the Democratic Party and even further left, seem to support. At the time, that seemed logical and made sense to them. And then later, Iraq was only, the Iraq War began about a year, our intervention began about a year and a half later. I do remember, though, to balance out this feeling of unity, the right taking advantage of this to castigate, basically treat as traitors or treason, people committing treason, anyone who had any problems with this. I remember Andrew Sullivan, famous columnist, was then at the New York Times, wrote something about how America had this fifth column of liberals and lefties who were determined to, destroy the country. And people like Christopher Hitchens went way off on, on the bend. I mean, this was, there wasn't a lack of political point scoring at the time. It didn't happen on September 12th, but very quickly. There was a lot of harsh rhetoric, I would say, mostly from the right, David Horowitz, people like that, or trying to blame Bill Clinton, and, who'd been out of office almost a year at that point. So there was a suspension of some critical judgment, like the worship of Giuliani in retrospect, when it could be argued he made some terrible decisions before that about the World Trade Center and the bunker. I'm not saying he certainly wasn't the cause of this. He didn't cause this, and I'm not saying I don't agree on the conspiracy theories, but all of that was cast aside because there was this kind of forced artificial unity that cast out on any dissent. So that should be remembered too.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Marty and then Amber.
Yeah, I remember it more of a time of unity, and I disagree with what Ramsey said, that because my memory is that there was a big uniting around the flag, rally around the flag atmosphere. I saw it all over the place. I live in Denver. But I got to admit, I wasn't as attuned to the news then as I am now. Back then, I was working full time and very, very busy with work and other things, and so I didn't read the news as much. So I think what Steve mentioned about the right castigating the left, I have no recollection of that. The and the and I think that's common universally. Whenever there's war, people often use war as a scapegoat. Politicians will use war as a scapegoat to take people's mind off of the troubles here at home. And I don't think that was the case with 9/11. And it's not always effective, as it wasn't during Vietnam. I think during Vietnam, when Kennedy wanted to put more troops in Vietnam, there was very little opposition. But as time progressed, we saw, hey, this isn't our war, so that the opposition arose. But I don't think it's a fair analogy regarding the coronavirus. It's a different animal than war, so I don't think that's analogous. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Marty. And we're going to come back to this notion of one party castigating the other party. That did in fact happen, but it wasn't so much partisan thing. It was more about, look, we just gone through what amounts to like our generation of Pearl Harbor. And if you dare to criticize any government response whatsoever, whether it's funding, military decision, then guess what? You're a traitor. And that was the pressure that was put on a lot of these politicians. Doesn't matter which party it is. So they were almost shunned from speaking out. We'll certainly get into that later, because there was this very weird period from about 2002 to 2006 where everybody, doesn't matter if you're left or right, they're all very pro-military for some reason. And that really shifted the US foreign policy during that era. And guess what? We're still living the effects of that policy from 2 decades ago. But that's a very interesting point we're going to explore later. But for now, let's just talk about, in the wake of 9/11, again, the early, first few weeks or months, there appeared to be some tremendous amount of goodwill and some kind of national unity. Let's talk more about that for a moment, if you recall any of that. So let's go with Amber, Andrew, then Katie.
I guess my experience didn't really, probably won't be an example of that. I do remember as a kid thinking about, I think the first time I ever heard thoughts and prayers was, on every news media outlet, in like the BBC, from around the world. We had ambassadors and stuff like that. So there was like this global goodwill and, praying for Americans to stay strong. There were a lot of donations. Whether it was the first time I knew globally that we donate, that other countries donated like firefighters and engineers and stuff like that to help America recover from this. And so I remember that in terms of unity, but my most vivid memory after the actual event was going to a memorial site on one of the bridges. We went to a lot of memorial sites at the time, but I remember going with my aunt to the bridge that she walked on, where she had to walk back. And they actually literally stopped traffic so people could go on the bridge and place flowers and names and stuff like that. And I remember a mosque. It was a God, I can't even think of the word. There was an imam who had led a group to the bridge, with everybody else, and they were handing out water. They were, also, grieving, mourning people they lost as well. And I remember this one guy, and it would never get out of my head. This one guy saw this woman putting down flowers. She was a Muslim woman, she was fully covered and everything. She was putting down flowers, and she was getting on her knees to pray, and he took her flowers up and threw them at her and kept screaming at her, terrorists, get off, get away from us, get away from us. You have no right to be here. How dare you show up here? And I remember just the absolute humiliation in her eyes and the tears, and it turned into a big argument and stuff like that. Eventually the guy was, people were able to push him back, but for the most part they let him, go on this tirade, and no one intervened, no one stopped him. It was only really when like the cops and like the organizer leaders got involved that he was made to go away. But just the extreme backlash afterwards that I started and I became more sensitive to was watching how mosques got vandalized, how Muslim people did get hurt, how Indian people were confused as Muslim because they wore turbans and stuff like that. And maybe it's because I lived in the Bronx, and I live next to a synagogue, a mosque. So like we have all major churches in at least a half a mile radius from us, and just the differences in respect and that people had for the mosques that were in the neighborhood. It was vandalized a lot, and people were harassed a lot. And so when I think about that time, I really only remember all the people who were harassed and humiliated, and weren't allowed to mourn with everybody else because they might have shared the same religion with the actual people who did this, and thinking it was not fair and everything. And then of course once it started hitting the media, it just like between whether it was Republicans talking about the evils of Islam, or Democrats talking about how we need to avenge ourselves, it just all I remember was all the hate afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Amber. And I think what Amber is mentioning there is right after this very short window of national unity, goodwill, it turned very ugly. And I remember seeing stories of just spikes in Islamophobia and attacks on not just people of Islamic faith, but anyone that looked like part of that group. And there were articles and articles about how Sikhs, who are not Muslims, they were being attacked because, I guess if you're just angry about something, you want to ostracize somebody and go after that. And I remember there were articles comparing that moment to what happened after Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans were taken to internment camps. And there were some prominent thinkers at the time saying, well, perhaps we should do something about Muslims living in America. Of course, that would be highly unconstitutional, but that idea was part of the national dialogue at the time. And there was just this massive hysteria over Islamophobia. And look, I mean, if you're, Muslim living in America, at that time, that was very hard. All right, Marty, and then we have, let's see, Avery, and then back to Ramsey.
So thank you. I wanted to touch on the war thing again. Yeah, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I sensed a big rally around the flag fever, which I thought was a good thing. And going to war in Afghanistan, not against Afghanistan. To me, my understanding was it was all about getting Osama bin Laden, and I was all in favor of it, and I have no regrets about that. You know, once he was finally killed 10 years later, you know, I was ready to get out at that point, and you know, but that's another story. I did want to mention that a couple of other things. By the time we went to war in Iraq, by that time, and I was opposed to that war, and 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 I think a lot of people were, the rally around the flag against Iraq. I didn't see that. You know, there was a lot of, you know, opposition to it that I heard at the time, and I was always opposed to it from the very beginning. I didn't see any connection to that in 9/11. I do want to mention one other thing, that I am, quote, either, I guess you could say, guilty, not of Islamophobia per se, but here is a situation. In the mid-90s, you had the Oslo Accords going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it was a brief, hopeful time that there might be peace. And Thomas Friedman, a journalist for the New York Times, I used to read his articles all the time at that time, and he was talking about how you know, Jews like myself, you know, should, you know, reach out to Arabs and go to and do business at their stores and stuff. And I took him up on it. There's a Arab strip mall, you know, just literally 5 minutes at the most from my house, and I started going shopping there all the time, you know, using their stores as much as I could. And then when 9/11 occurred, I stopped going there because I've always heard that, you know, some of these businesses are used as fronts, you know, to traffic money to terrorist organizations and that kind of thing. And so I just stopped going. I didn't harass any of them. And when someone in a hijab is, you know, going into the same store as I am, you know, I'll hold the door open for him. You know, so I wouldn't say I'm an Islamophobe, you know, but I just decided not to do business with them anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marty. Let's go to Avery, then.
So I just want to preface this by saying that I'm from Canada personally, so I didn't actually experience the exact same context that, you know, people from the United States did. But with that being said, I do recall a sense of national unity or even international unity, and I think that there were a lot of people coming together for genuine reasons. But I also think that got exploited too, like the US government and even my country making the Patriot Act, for example. So there were people who were coming together, but the governments were taking advantage of that to put in laws like to allow people to get arrested who were just suspect, like just looked suspect or whatever. And then there was beefing up of like TFSA, and that led to a lot of racial profiling. And then, you know, this whole national unity thing that was going on at the time kind of allowed for the war in Afghanistan, right? Because people were supporting that, because people went together. And so US officials wanted to, you know, fight back. And so, you know, and then I think that a lot of people who were just, you know, coming together for good deeds got, you know, exploited in the process. Anyways, that's all I had to say on that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for sharing your perspectives. Let's go to Ramsey.
Yeah, I did want to touch base on the rallying around the flag aspect, and what Avery just brought up too is very it does ring true, because I think that, you know, there has been a historic reframing and boogeyman effect around, you know, Arabs and Muslims in light of 9/11. I think that you know, there was very much a pro-military, America effect after 9/11. And yeah, in some ways that could be seen as a good thing, but at the same time, it could be seen as very dangerous because it stifled any sort of dissent. And you need dissent in a democracy to really be a healthy democracy and healthy republic. So when you have people who oppose any sort of, overreach by the military, overreach by, the surveillance apparatus that we've seen come out of 9/11, at that time, it was very dangerous. Look at what happened to the Dixie Chicks. They basically were canceled before canceling was a thing. And as what Avery said, there was a huge, I would say maybe disproportionate reaction to some of the events that happened. For example, the emergence of this huge surveillance apparatus that, as in recent years has demonstrated, has really sort of overstepped its bounds, and the trampling of civil liberties for the American population, for also foreign nationals who are have been surveilled by U.S. intelligence. It does really beg the question: is like, was the trade-off really worth it? Was the trade-off really worth giving up a lot of our civil liberties for the sake of security? And I don't even know if we can even really say that we're that much safer. I mean, and even if we are, we have sort of, given up a lot of what was worth fighting for in this country in the first place. I will also say that in regards to the Islamophobia aspects, yes, there was definitely a boogeymaning of Arabs and Muslims specifically. There was sort of like almost an overnight rewriting of what a terrorist was defined as, an overnight reframing of terrorists as being solely an Arab or Muslim person. Whereas historically, throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, there have been terrorists of every color, creed, religion throughout spanning history, spanning throughout time. Look at the KKK, look at Timothy McVeigh, look at all these organizations that look at the IRA, look at all these organizations that have engaged in terrorist activities, and yet for some reason, and I'm not saying that like boo-hoo, Al-Qaeda is being treated wrongly. No, I don't think they're being treated wrongly. But I think that when you frame a certain people, a certain race and ethnicity as the boogeymen, and reframe that only this group of people can engage in this type of behavior, that's very dangerous. That's very, very dangerous. And I feel like it's something that we didn't really guard against then, but I feel like hopefully people are waking up to that now.
Thanks, Ramsey. To his credit, whether if you agree with this or not, President George W. Bush did make a very clear comment that this is not war on Islam. This is against certain factions who are these extremists who act on the extremist ideologies. And I remember he even gave like an Oval Office speech saying, "Look, Islam is a religion of peace, but we're going after these bad actors in Afghanistan." So he did make kind of like an overt olive branch to the Islamic community, and he met with a lot of the faith leaders at the time too, to reassure them that this is not like a wholesale war based on ideology. A couple other points that Ramsey made, and I know I'm getting a little ahead, but I'm going to bring it up now because he mentioned about the Dixie Chicks. And look, I mean, right now the main kind of like culture war thing is the cancel culture. Well, guess who started the cancel culture? It was back then. Dixie Chicks, who, they're country singers from Texas. And they said, look, we're Texans, but we're not proud of being Texans right now because George W. Bush is also from Texas. And he's doing all these military interventions in a war of terror, and we're very, embarrassed about that. Guess what? They were canceled. Do you know who else was canceled? Bill Maher. He had a television show called Politically Incorrect, and he said, "Gee, I wonder if the U.S. foreign policy had anything to do with radicalizing these perpetrators on 9/11." Guess what? He was canceled because these major TV networks said, "How dare you criticize American government?" Canceled. Who else got canceled? What's his name? Phil Donahue. For those of you who don't remember Phil Donahue, he's a very mild-mannered, like a daytime talk show host. His topics were not even political. They would talk about some, very benign, like, social issues on a daytime show. And on one episode, he said, "Look, we're about to go to war. Why are we going to war in Iraq?" And guess what? He was canceled. You know who else got canceled? French fries, because in Congress, in the congressional cafeteria, when France said, "No, we don't support this war in Iraq, there's no evidence of WMDs." Well, these members of Congress said, "We shall cancel French fries and rename them freedom fries, because nothing defines freedom like, deep fried potatoes with ketchup that's going to give me a greasy, satisfaction." Freedom fries. So if you look at throughout that period, we went through this very weird phase where we were acting kind of irrationally based on, these, I guess, what appeared to be these, perceived threats. Maybe we overreacted, but that's a very interesting point that Ramsey brings up. Okay, let's go to some other members. Andrew, Katie, then Matt.
All right. I think with the situation with the first responders, there was a lot of generosity towards them, especially the firemen and police officers and all the nurses. But even with that, there's a bit of a backlash towards the funding because most of them still have health complications nowadays due to all the smoke they inhaled, and now they have long-term damage. I think even since we're both New Jerseyans, Tom and us, and I'm pretty sure other people here, Jon Stewart had some kind of compensation bill he was trying to pass through, was it Congress? And he was having a huge argument with Rand Paul about if we should give more funding towards the first responders who were there. So that kind of gets me in a more worrying aspect of if, let's say, we do have another reaction or another event like this, God forbid, where it would go. I have a feeling it will probably be more of like a storm, because all the Twitter lefties will be like, well, we shouldn't be going here, and then the right will be like, well, we should. But I mean, the whole reactionary moment when people are like, neither we're going to war, or if you disagree, you're against us. I think that was fairly what I remembered too back then. I think even Jonathan Hannah from his book, The Righteous Mind, talked about this with the whole tribalistic sense, which it can be very, very dangerous at times if it gets out of hand. And especially now with how we went to the Middle East, and we accomplished our mission, but I felt like we did it in such a poor way that the only people who won are pretty much the weapon manufacturers who were able to sell off the weapons. I think if we definitely headed off this with more of a cool mind and actually like thought about, okay, what are our goals and what are we going to do, rather than just this reactionary, we need payback and we need payback now, it would have been much better. But yeah, I think it'll be much better if we definitely handle this with a cool mind.
Thanks, Andrew. I guess just the American psyche is, look, I mean, other than Pearl Harbor and perhaps some, German U-boats, during World War II, I mean, there were no like real threats on the American soil from, foreign hostile forces. So in wake of 9/11, I mean, if the government response was nothing, I think there would have been massive outcry from the rest of the citizens. So there had to be something, at least some kind of response, bring these perpetrators to justice, something. But that effort, I think, again, was it proportional to the lives that we lost? And Andrew mentions about these, first responders. I think it's called the 9/11 Rescuers Compensation Fund. It's like a Jim Zadroga Act or something, and that keeps on getting delayed or defunded. But that should also be counted in terms of the losses that we suffered, because a lot of people who were at ground zero, in addition to the lives that were perished, now they are suffering from long-term illnesses, respiratory illnesses, and sometimes these things don't come about until decades later. So again, considering all that, was our response proportional? And that's kind of what we're going to get into next. So let's go to some other members first. We have Katie, then Matt, then Amber.
I agree with you, Thomas, on your thoughts on whether that there has to be some response in response to what happened. And I really liked Steve's comments about world sympathy. That was another thing when I was in my interest on 9/11, watching like other countries put flowers around like in public places, and there was a big outpouring of sympathy. My main point was really just what if bin Laden had been American? I agree with Ramsey that they're not the only ones to suffer from having madmen in their midst. Timothy McVeigh, there's terrorism. But I think a big struggle is, in my mind, is just that I guess I feel like part of the problem is they have weak institutions. I mean, ideally you would have, if in a functional place, you would have them, like if that happened in the US, the FBI or whatever the appropriate person would be going after them and dealing with the issue and isolating it from society. And I feel like if Afghanistan's so weak, their institutions are so weak that they can't do that for themselves. That response is not coming from internally. So that would be my only criticism. But also I have hope for the future. When I'm viewing all these Afghani videos, I think that they can have a wonderful society. It's just institutionally they're a weak place.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Just one comment, because I think you made a very interesting point. What if bin Laden was American? Well, the truth of the matter is he was not a US citizen, but he was a US ally at one point. And that's another area of amnesia that the Americans have when it comes to bin Laden. At the time when there was a civil war in Afghanistan, well, not a civil war, but when they were fighting off the Soviet forces in the 1980s, bin Laden was supported by the CIA. Bin Laden was part of the Mujahideen who resisted the communist forces during the Soviet occupation. So we bankrolled these folks who were part of the Mujahideen, the Northern Alliance, and they wanted these forces to repel the Soviet Union. So on one hand, they were on our payroll, we supported them. And on the other hand, now they're our enemy. The reason why bin Laden got radicalized is because after the first Gulf War, US had military installations in Saudi Arabia. And bin Laden's family comes from Saudi Arabia. And, if you're Muslim, Saudi Arabia has two of the holiest sites in that country. And they're like, how dare you put American, and these weren't just some like small barracks, these are huge military Air Force bases right in the heart of Saudi Arabia. So bin Laden got radicalized. Again, I'm not justifying his radicalization. No, that's wrong. But the way how he saw the world is, how dare you put huge military installations in a country with the holiest sites of our religion. So that got him very radicalized, and he wanted to bring that into action. If you'll notice, by the way, US government never talks about this. We quietly withdrew from Saudi Arabia. We no longer have Air Force bases in Saudi Arabia. Now we have these fleets in Bahrain and other places, but not in Saudi. So that's another important factor that we should look at, because there's a reason why certain things happen in the way they did. Again, it's not a justification at all, but we have to put things in context. We supported this guy, he acted based on certain military decisions that the US made, whether you agree with that or not, and then there's consequences. So, okay, let's go to some other members. Matt and then Amber. Hi, Matt.
Thanks, Thomas. Hey, everybody. I just want to start off by saying this is my first time tuning in with the NYC Political Forum, sharing your stories and your ideas and everything. It's been awesome listening so far, and I definitely share what Thomas said about kind of the value of meetup and being able to be in Chicago right now. Is it cutting out a little bit? Sorry about that. Bad connection?
You're fine.
But I'm actually in Chicago right now, so I wouldn't be able to attend if it weren't for Zoom. Yeah, but actually, off of something that Ramsey said, kind of a question for the group. I was 3 when 9/11 happened, so I don't have any personal recollection of it. And since then, my image of what coming from the media and also like the news media, but also TV shows, movies, that kind of stuff, and kind of like the Arab Muslim terrorist, despite the fact that, as Ramsey mentioned, there's terrorists of all different ideologies, nationalities, everything like that. So I guess a question for some people that kind of maybe had an idea or were kind of following the news before, different, I guess, image that came word terrorist. And I know Amber has her hand up, but if anyone wanted to respond to that before we move.
I'm sorry, Matt, if you could just reiterate the question once more. I missed it.
Yeah, so I was saying that since I was young when 9/11 happened, ever since then, the only image, I guess, that's been associated with the word terrorist in the media that I consumed growing up, and even to this point, Middle Eastern terrorists, despite the fact that, as Ramsey mentioned, there's the IRA, or you could think about like FARC in Colombia, that kind of terrorism. And so was the image in people's minds before 9/11, if you could recall, a different image of what a terrorist was?
Sure, I could answer that question, and others, if you want to chime in, feel free to do that too. So I guess pre 9/11, we also had the attacks on in 1993, the first attack at the World Trade Center. We also had attacks in the Kenya embassy, the USS Cole. I mean, you could go down the list. The Beirut barracks where U.S. troops were stationed. I think approximately 200 U.S. troops were killed. So there's a long track record. But I think in the post-9 or in the 9/11 era, we try to equate terrorism in terms of those who are the extremists, right, from the Middle East. But look, I'll say this way: you go around the world and ask other people who are the terrorists, and terrorism, the word is in the eye of the beholder. And if you live in Pakistan, you're going to say the US are the terrorists. Why? Because we drone and we kill innocent people. The collateral damage that we create by going after these targets, there's more innocent women and children killed in places like hospitals and worship centers and schools. So, it's a very thorny issue, but, a lot of the damage that we create to other people are just as bad as what those other people have done to us. Now, on an event like 9/11, everything gets very sensationalized because, it took place in our home soil. It never happened before. And the manner in which how we were struck is just unconscionable. Very true. But honestly, terrorism is always in the eyes of the beholder. You go back to the revolutionary period, the redcoats, the British thought, the American revolutionaries in the military, or the militias rather, they were the terrorists. How dare you attack King's Army? Terrorists, because they're engaging in guerrilla warfare. So history is always interpreted based on who the victors are. Obviously, in the Revolutionary War, America prevailed. So we were the, seeking independence from the imperial tyranny. And you just go down the list, and it really depends on how you define it and which side is the prevailing party. So it's a very complex question. It's a good question, and these are the things that we should be talking about. Because, see, the thing is, if I were talking like this right after 9/11, I would have been canceled because they would be like, how dare you speak out against American government? Well, guess what, guys? We live in a society where we have freedom of speech and everyone's views should be respected. And no one should be canceled or, castigated because their views don't conform to certain, conventional wisdom. All right, I spoke too much here, so I'm going to go to Amber and then we'll move on to the next subject. But Matt, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Thomas said. Before, and again, I was young, so didn't really have that many memories of all the different, whether it's domestic terrorist attacks or foreign attacks that were happening around that time. But when there were started to be talks of war and everything like that, the one thing I kept remembering people say was, it doesn't matter why these people decided to attack us. It matters that, it happened. And later on, it started turning into, well, they attacked us because of we're free and they're not, and they don't like freedom. They hate America because of freedom. And I just remember that never sitting right with me as a kid. Like, who would attack another country or do all this damage because they don't like the thing that anybody can pretty much have? Like, it doesn't make sense. They have their own moral system, and so we don't fit in it. I don't think I'd fly hundreds of miles to go kill a bunch of people because they don't agree with that. And at the time, for me, anything that was a terrorist was basically anyone who had extreme views and killed a bunch of people. So like, I think at the like the most memorable ones at the time were like when abortion clinics were getting bombed and abortion doctors were being killed. Obviously, there were Black churches being burnt down. Timothy McVeigh. So like those type of guys were what I viewed as a terrorist, and then 9/11 happened, and they just were added to the list of what terroristic people do. But I never got into in my head that only Arabs or Muslims are terrorists. Especially since when it comes to media, America pretty much does, like, you'll notice that was James Bond movies. Whoever America is beefing with at the time, that is who is always going to be the villain in most movies. So when it was, the Cold War, every villain for every movie was the Russians. When it was, when you're doing the 90s, everything was still Arabs who were like the terrorists, because we still had, what is that called? The Persian War and all that other type of stuff. So not the Persian War, the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. So it just moves along with whoever we don't like at the time. That's who's going to be the villain in our movies. But for the most part, I didn't understand. I still to this day really don't understand how we ended up in Afghanistan or Iraq. The way we ended up killing Bin Laden with that tactical team that went into Pakistan. That should have been the plan in the beginning. I didn't understand. And Thomas is right. Bush did go out there and try as hard as he could to make sure it was an Islam versus us thing. But at the same time, you went into a country that didn't declare war on you and basically bombed it to hell. And the reasoning that a lot of people were giving was, oh, well, terrorists came here to hurt us, or terrorists hate us because we're free and they don't like that. When at the same time, we had 3,000 people die in September 11. I think maybe another 25,000 people were injured. We've killed 3 times over that in Afghanistan alone. The same amount of soldiers died in the Afghanistan war as the people who died in 9/11. So what did we actually accomplish? We didn't win hearts and minds because, like Thomas pointed out, our image is, one thing here at home. We think we're everybody's savior and everybody loves us, but then you go outside the world and what does a 9-year-old think of when you bomb my house and kill my father, but then you build a school? Like, do I remember that you built a school or that you killed my father? And then I grow up and I'm going to have American views, and all I see on TV is Americans, going around the world doing the same thing that happened to me in other places, and watching these man versus food shows, and you eat like tons of food when I'm here starving. That's not a good representation or a good image I'm going to have of you. So I kind of feel like it was counterproductive. We said we were doing this to stop Afghanistan from being a terrorist breeding ground, but all we do is create terroristic breeding grounds all over the world, because we just don't seem to we have a disconnect with reality, of who we really are to other people. So that's.
Okay, thanks, Amber. Let's go to Andrew, then Ramsey.
Yeah, just to go along with Amber's statement. I mean, there were kind of little stuff we did in the Middle East. I think in the Middle East we had our gripes, we at least had some kind of background with meddling around in that area, especially with Afghanistan during the Ronald Reagan years and the Soviet Unions and the Cold War stuff. I know with Afghanistan specifically, while we were there was an expansion of women's rights and all that stuff, and education was more easily available for women. And now due to us just leaving, there might be a situation that those rights might be being in danger of violated. But even with that, it seems like we did leave a mark in terms of the education and giving those rights to Afghan, because the Taliban surprisingly seems like there are some factions that agree with giving women education, but it's through like an Islamic kind of view. So I don't know where that's going to go. So there were kind of like some stuff we did, but overall I do agree with the statement. It's like, if we're going to drone strike random people, and I believe like 90% of the time it doesn't lead to the accurate results that we were trying to gain, it's going to breed more vengeance towards the USA, and it's going to probably breed more terrorism in the long end. I have a feeling probably Dick Cheney was in role of trying to persuade Bush to do a little bit of nation building or something like that, or obviously exploitations of trying to get resources from these places, such as oil. But I do want to say that there were some good we did, but I think the bad more outweighs the good during this whole expedition we had in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for those comments. We did talk about Afghanistan in our last meetup, and I'll just kind of summarize it this way, because what Andrew just mentioned kind of shows you that the U.S. objectives, the goalposts kept on shifting. Again, if you look at the YouTube videos or articles in wake of 9/11, when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, by the way, that was a NATO Article 5 mission. So for the first time, NATO invoked Article 5. Attack on one is attack on all. So there's this tremendous amount of goodwill. But if you look at the Bush administration's kind of sloganeering, it was like, we got to fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. We're going to go to the caves and just smoke them out, like, like throw a big grenade in there and just smoke them out. And, there was like these posters, wanted dead or alive, Well, guess what? It went from that into, well, guess what? 20 years later, we built some schools and we improved the livelihood of women in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but if that's what you have to show for after 2 decades, after trillions of dollars, after all the lives and treasure that we invested, boy, that's not a good return, is it? Okay, let's go to Ramsey and then Marty.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of, I guess, double down on something that Amber said, and I think it actually ties into something that Katie brought up about institutions. So, you know, the whole idea that, yeah, it did spread around after 9/11 of that, oh, the terrorists just hate our way of life and they want to destroy countries that have freedom. It doesn't really hold up. It doesn't really hold true. If anything, actually, I think one of the main motivations for terrorists, and whether it's that, whether that rings true or not, is that they blame the US for their lack of freedom. So they blame the US for the issues that are rampant in their countries. And, you know, there can certainly be a debate as to whether or not that rationale holds up itself. But I don't think there's any denying that the US has meddled in foreign countries to the detriment of their populations, the detriment of their citizens and the rights of their citizens. I mean, look, for example, Amber brought up the first Gulf War. That was a huge event in the Middle East. Before the first Gulf War, Iraq actually was close to being considered what would be, quote unquote, a first world country. They had developed institutions, developed infrastructure. They had, you know, first rate healthcare. They were basically, like, I guess what you would say, a shining example in the Middle East of what, you know, I mean, they still had Saddam Hussein in power, who was a, you know, who was a horrible dictator. But again, we need to remember that the US actually was the one who propped up his regime in the first place. But again, like I said, before the first Gulf War, Iraq was considered very close to being what we would consider a first world country, and had developed infrastructure and developed institutions. After the first Gulf War, basically when the US came in and bombed the ever living crap out of them, that changed. And it's not just the Middle East. Like, look at how historically the US has had a hand in meddling in the affairs of South America and propping up several South American dictatorships that have, you know, hurt and really trampled on the rights of, you know, those people. So I think that, you know, there is this idea that, like, that they want to attack us for our freedom. It just doesn't ring true. But also the fact that they have such underdeveloped institutions in the first place that really, you know, can't respond to these threats of terror within their countries is in part maybe the fault of the United States, because of our meddling, because of our, you know, neo-colonialist foreign policy in many regards. You know, it really has crippled some of these countries in regards to obtaining, you know, true development in that regard. I'm done speaking.
Okay, thanks, Ramsey. Before we go on to Marty, I just want to address 2 points. One is regarding this kind of apparent secularism that Saddam portrayed to the rest of the world. The other one is what breeds this kind of extremism that results in active terror. So in terms of Saddam, Ramsey's absolutely correct. During the Iran-Iraq war, we decided that Iraq were the good guys and Iran were the bad guys. Why was that? Because Saddam, again, terrible dictator, and there's plenty of dictators that US has backed before, whether it's, you know, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt or, you know, the Saudi princes. But we decided that the US, that Saddam is a good guy because he's not an ideologue. By and large, he's more of kind of like a, you know, like a military dictator rather than someone who would act out on his religious ideologies. You know, he would always, you know, dress up in, like, you know, suit and a tie as opposed to like a religious garb. So back in the 80s, US said, this is your poster child for what a Middle East leader could look like. A strong man with strong, you know, grip on the military, but not an ideologue, you know, based on, I guess, you know, some fundamental beliefs on religion. So there's a very famous video of Donald Rumsfeld in 1983 going to Iraq, shaking Saddam's hand, basically saying, you're our ally. We will back you no matter what during this conflict of Iraq and Iran. Back in 1988, when Saddam was using, by the way, gas on, he unleashed chemical attacks on his own people, the Kurdish people. Ronald Reagan said, whatever Saddam does in his own country, that's his business. We're not here to intermingle. So the US was fully aware of it. And by the tacit lack of objection, that was pretty much an approval of what he did. But then by 1991, the tides have changed. That's a whole nother thing. But the irony here is that we've engaged in two military conflicts, and both leaders, bin Laden and Hussein, were once upon a time the US allies. So this kind of shows the inconsistency of the US foreign policy, where on one hand, these are our dependable allies that we need in order to defeat another bad actor. Then the table has turned. Now we're going after them because it's either you're with us or you're against us. So that's really the irony of the US foreign policy. The second point I'll mention about what Ramsey said, if you look at a lot of the experts who study extremist groups and terrorists, it's usually people who grow up seeing a lot of violence, and there's a lot of instability in their society, and they resort to these ideologies as a last resort because it's really easy to get radicalized. And when there's when you grow up in a country, whether it's Pakistan or Afghanistan, and what you see every day are these drone strikes and military installations just bombing places. Well, guess what? You're going to become radicalized because there's no hope. There's no economic opportunity for you to go to school, succeed, and do something in life. So you become radicalized. Yeah, I'm not justifying the radicalization. No, that's wrong. But the US military responses is the perfect breeding ground for these folks to get radicalized. So unfortunately, we'll get to this a bit later, our response in the last 2 decades, we have created a whole new generation of these extremists. Some of them were probably not even alive on 9/11, 2001, but in wake of what we have done, now they're seeing this day in, day out, and now they're being radicalized. Somebody asked earlier, who are the terrorists? Well, in the eyes of these people who grew up in these environments, they look at the drone strikes as, well, that drone has an American flag on it, and they're attacking us for what? So unfortunately, it's going to have unintended repercussions. And, I think we haven't seen the end of it, but, that's very unfortunate. Okay, let's go to Marty and then Kate.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I agree with Amber on and Ramsey is when Bush, said, the reason they attacked us is because they hate freedom. Yeah, I thought that was totally bogus on Bush's part. But that aside, in terms of how people are going to react, I think there are a lot of variables that need to be considered. If Thomas, what you just said and what Amber said and Ramsey said was true, then Japan, Germany, South Korea, probably the Philippines, none of them would be friends with us and allies with us, because we bombed the hell out of we certainly bombed the hell out of Japan and Germany, and now we're all good pals. In the Philippines, in the what was it, 1898 or something, we were, over there, killing many people, many innocent people. It was not justified, in my opinion, from the little I've read about it. But yet, the Philippines and the US have been good friends for quite a long time. So there are a lot of other factors to take into consideration, including, what the cause is, the culture, etc. Someone also mentioned that we do random drone strikes, and they're not random. There's a lot of care taken into them, to all the strikes. They always factor in how many civilians are going to be killed. And there's some arbitrary number that they might come up with depending on the target. And you can say, gee, that's not nice, that's not fair, it's murder, whatever you want to say. But that's the reality of war. to say that Iraq is a shining example to the Mideast, I mean, I'm not even going to go down that road. It's just beyond bizarre for me. But I want to give another example where I want to give an example where we give care about where we strike. You know, when Iran, under the Trump administration, when Iran shot down one of our drones, and we claimed it was in international territory, over international water or whatever. So Trump was going to do a retaliatory strike, and then he called it back 10 minutes before it was about to begin, because he learned that some 150 people would be killed, you know, during these strikes, and many of them probably were going to be civilian. So he decided not to do that retaliatory strike. Okay, thank you. That's all I got.
Just one response, Marty, and then we'll Katie and Tal. Those other military engagements, whether it's the Spanish-American War that resulted in the U.S. occupation of Philippines, Japan, Korea, there was authorization to use military force. Congress declared war, and although I guess in Korea it was a UN mission, but with Japan, Congress declared war. And what's really troubling, all of us here should be all troubled by this. And again, this is not a partisan issue. You have President Obama with this kill list. He's got this, like a book of all the people that he's going to kill today. So what does he do? He has a meeting with his NSA advisor. Let's see, who should we kill today? Okay, this guy, bad guy. Mr. President, do you approve the execution of these individuals via drone strikes? Go, Johnny, go do it. Really? I mean, is that what you want the US president to do? Again, it's not a partisan issue, but again, if you're okay with the US president having a kill list to just unilaterally execute somebody on moment's notice, yes, Marty, you are correct. They do take into consideration of collateral attack, and I'm sure it's very precise attack to minimize, but the reality is people do get killed, innocent, women and children.
Of course, that's war. Yeah.
And you want a U.S. president to have that power?
No, I never said that president should have any kind of complete power.
Yeah. So again, all of us should be troubled by that, and that is the product of 9/11, and we should be outraged.
I'm opposed to the War Powers Act.
Yeah. So okay. So anyway, that's something to kind of think about too, because sometimes we kind of forget about that part of it. All right. So thanks for your comments, Marty. Let's go to Katie and Tal.
I'm circling back to some comments that you made, Thomas, because that's always interesting to me to separate to try to figure out like what are the roots of terrorism, and you mentioned both, and I'm always trying to like religious motivation and also poverty, because like Bin Laden was not I agree with you, like the poverty might give him might give terrorism a popular support, instead of if someone did that in the US, they might kind of become a pariah or be like, oh, there's that weirdo Marilyn Manson that does this weird stuff, and then you get ostracized and embarrassed in the public for having these motivation to harm people. Bin Laden, my point on Bin Laden himself was not poor. A lot of the people that blew themselves up, they weren't poor. Their motivation was religious, in my opinion, from what I understand, and I should, yeah. You're muted, Thomas. I'd love to.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Bin Laden came from a very prominent family. They're from Saudi Arabia. They own construction companies. They were pretty wealthy, and Bin Laden would have been an heir apparent to that family business. But just like a lot of these folks, they get radicalized when they have a certain traditional view of what their society should look like. And I believe Bin Laden was in Lebanon in the 1980s, and he's like, wow, Lebanon is a very traditional society. Why are people dressed like Westerners, and why are all these American troops here? And I think, again, I'm not justifying his radicalization, but when their traditional notion of society conflicts with what's on the ground, he got radicalized. Bin Laden is a bit of a special case though, because he was also kind of a pariah because he got basically excommunicated from his family. He was kicked out of Saudi Arabia because he was just too much of a radical. I think he went to like Yemen or Somalia or somewhere, and that's when he really became radicalized. And then he found refuge in Afghanistan because he had no other place to go. It's not like he woke up one day and he decided to make a pilgrimage to Afghanistan, but he had no other place to go other than Afghanistan. And that's where he kind of learned, the military tactics of how to, resist against an occupying force. Back then it was Saudi Arabia. So the point is, folks like Bin Laden and all these other extremists, they look at what the Western world has done to shape their society. And again, for better or for worse, for them, they look at it as this is a big, slap in the face to their traditionalism. And that's how they become radicalized. And they exploit that to then recruit others. And these others, who join these forces, they're the ones that go through, extreme economic hardship with no prospect of future whatsoever. And they promise them all these lofty, rewards of, if you commit jihad, then you'll be rewarded in, afterlife with all these things. A lot of it is pretty, farcical if you ask me, but that's how they recruit these people. It's unfortunate, but that's the world that we live in. Okay, Tal, and then Sam.
Thanks. So I think around the same idea you just mentioned, as well as Katie, I think one of the areas where the US sometimes lacks investment in is actually understanding the society in which they're getting involved. I think I obviously agree with the same values the US is after, just because I grew up within a society that's more westernized, and I see value in such freedom. I'm not as close to my religion in the sense that that's where my convictions come from the way I think the society should be built around. So I think where the US got involved in countries where they shared values to some extent, they might have been more successful, and maybe the radicalization did not lead to bombing or any long-lasting animosity towards the United States. But within society where the radicalization is coming from values that maybe the US does not have as much understanding, sometimes I feel there's some sort of naivety coming from the US, thinking that the societies there were just waiting for the US to come and save them. And as soon as the US is gonna change something, they're just gonna go right into democracy or right into the liberty that the US has to offer, where their actual day-to-day stuff that they deal with, that maybe the people that are controlling right now, helping them more than what we just seem to prop up and then leave. And I think that really came up with the whole discussion about whether the UN has got to recognize the Taliban, yes or no, whether we sort of threatening them, whether if you're not going to do this and that, we're not going to give you world recognition. I don't think they necessarily want that. I don't think necessarily something that they consider. They're trying to follow our values. And this is something they consider. I think this is some sort of the lack of understanding of how these groups operate and what they're really after. And I think sometimes that's what leads to failure in these sort of wars. Same thing with Iraq, for example.
Okay, thanks, Al. Let's go to Sam.
Thanks, Don. A couple of points. I guess first point in answering Marty's statement, basically drone attacks in Afghanistan, probably Pakistan too, level of collateral damage or civilians being killed is 90%. And this estimate is by Daniel Hale, who was basically a US Air Force analyst, who is currently serving 5 years in jail for blowing the whistle on that operation. So, this is the truth you're presented with. You can do whatever. I mean, maybe it doesn't agree with your assumptions, but that's how things are. And this has been going on for a long time. It's, not just the last year, but pretty much last 15, 20 years. So, I mean, that sort of gives you an idea of why, Afghanistan folded so quickly. 15 years of drone bombings and taking out weddings and funerals is not going to leave a lot of friends for the current policy there. Okay, and the second point, Iraq was 1980s by all measures a very sort of affluent society. They had pretty much everything except democracy. They had the sort of like probably their healthcare system was better than one United States today. They had the free college education. They had sort of like all kinds of privileges that, for example, you had in Libya also before that country was invaded as well. It's kind of similar. The third point is that we have been supporting Al Qaeda and their affiliates in Syria for the last 10 years against the Assad government, and that's sort of like it's kind of like going back full circle to the situation it was in Afghanistan prior in the 1990s, and that's kind of in today's context, it's food for thought.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Although I don't think we were directly supporting Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is kind of a newer invention in the 90s. I think the US was supporting those who were in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, and these kind of ragtag military group called the Northern Alliance, who later on got radicalized and they started to recruit the future members of Al-Qaeda. But again, that's the irony of all ironies. It's kind of like, on one hand, we're allies. On the other hand, now we're going to war against them. So that's what we've been doing for the last 2 decades. All right. Why don't we shift away from the foreign policy? And again, let's take a look at what happened here domestically in the US in wake of 9/11. Maybe some of you remember this. But right after the attacks on September 11th, there were these like massive hysteria about anthrax. It was all about anthrax, Next time when you get something in the mail, be careful. Somebody might have mailed you some anthrax, right? And people were going crazy. And again, some of you may not remember this, but there was this like hysterical message on news channels. They're telling people, look, you better put duct tape around the windows of your home because someone's going to just spray anthrax into your house. And people are actually going out buying duct tapes and putting, sealing their windows and the doors so that, they don't get attacked. And, there was, public safety concerns about how they will use chemical weapons. These countries were, working on nuclear weapons to attack America. So that was really the kind of the mood of the country by late 2001. This would have been like November, December. And then Congress just comes in swiftly, passes the Patriot Act. Like no questions asked, like no debate whatsoever. So does anyone have any recollection or any kind of comment on the passage of all these massive government programs?
I just remember the anthrax, and that was a US scientist. He forged, or he had a letter, I think, saying kind of misleading, thinking that it was more of terrorists, but it was a scientist. He was US. I forget his name.
Right, there was that scientist in Florida, I believe. There's also some very mysterious letter showed up to one of the members of Congress. And I don't know if you guys remember Tom Brokaw on NBC, news channel. Some mysterious envelope showed up to his office with what appeared to have white powder. Again, I don't know what the sources of those, materials were, but this was like a major public safety threat at the time.
Yeah, Thomas, I would add that the congressmen or the senators that were targeted were the ones who were opposed to war, including Pat Leahy and another Democrat whose name escapes me right now.
I think it was Tom Daschle. He was the the U.S. Senate Majority Leader on the Democratic Party. By the way, he lost in 2002. Again, why? Because I think Steve used the word castigated. That is the right word, because if you showed not even any opposition, but just ask questions like, hey, you want to do a massive $1 trillion, effort. How are you going to pay for it? Guess what? You're automatically castigated as now you're sympathizing with an enemy. I'll just give you one other example. I don't know if you guys remember who Max Cleland was. He was a senator from the state of Georgia. He was a Vietnam veteran. He's a double amputee. He lost both of his legs serving in the Vietnam War. I mean, that's a pretty heroic stuff, Purple Heart recipients. And he was a pretty like a moderate Democrat, like a Southern Democrat in the state of Georgia. When they were appropriating, the congressional budget for the war in Afghanistan, he was simply asking the question, like, how are you going to pay for this stuff? And they ran a negative ad against him, Karl Rove, saying that, he must be pro, Al-Qaeda, because how dare he question the war president. So, again, that was kind of the mood of the country. And guess what? He lost the election at that time to some guy named Saxby Chambliss, because he's like, I am pro-patriotic. I'm going to back the president. And this, Vietnam veteran who won the Purple Heart, he appears to be an Al-Qaeda sympathizer. That was really the mood of the country. So, we should really keep that in mind that, sometimes we tend to act on these emotional things without thinking through, the actual nuts and bolts of what's going on. All right. Let's see. Andrew has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say with the Patriots Act, I mean, I think you had pretty much explained it at the end, Thomas. I mean, it had good intentions, but now those intentions are getting out of hand because now we have these tech companies who are now paired up with the government to pretty much act as some sort of surveillance system in terms in which they can pretty much keep an eye on everyone and pretty much intrude on people's rights of privacy. I think this is pretty much the dangerous tense of how war can prop up certain aspects of the government in which they want to go ahead and facilitate pretty good policies at first, but then they become very harmful at the end, unfortunately, because people don't realize the consequences of their actions of being too reactionary during the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I mean, the thing that's troubling about the Patriot Act is that it has all kinds of provisions that conflicts with the Constitution. The writ of habeas corpus, that means you have the right to seek some kind of a hearing before you're detained. That was put aside. Warrantless searches. Again, if the government ever wants to search you, they have to get a warrant. Nope, not anymore. In fact, the US became this massive surveillance state. There are these things called the John Doe Warrants. And what that means is usually when you want to arrest somebody, you have to go see a judge and get a warrant. And you got to tell the judge, I'm going to arrest this person because they did X, Y, and Z, and there's probable cause. And you have to explain to the judge what the probable cause is. Now with the John Doe Warrant, it's like, we're going to arrest this guy to be named later. We think we know who this guy is, but we don't know his name. So we're just going to call him John Doe. And once we arrest this person, then we're going to connect him up later with a true identity. To me, that is what they do in third world countries. And now you want to give that power to the government. So it seems like people who really should be caring about these things didn't really speak out at the time. And the troubling sign is that once you give government these powers, they're never going to relinquish it later. They're never going to say like 10 years later, dear citizens, I'm afraid that we took away too many powers. Now we're going to give this back to you. The government never does that. Government will then find ways to, to consolidate more powers against you. Now, to be fair, a lot of the provisions in the Patriot Act did have a sunset provision of like 10 years. But when it came to renewing these provisions, again, I think the word castigated is the right word because, there was this public pressure for the members of Congress to renew that because otherwise you are seen as being too soft on terror. You got to give all of, the executive branch all the tools necessary to catch the bad guys and keep us safe. Yet at the same time, these things directly conflict with our Constitution. And we never really had a true debate about that. By the way, the only people who objected to these things being very consistent on their principle, 3 people come to mind. And maybe there could be a few more. Ron Paul, Barbara Lee, she's the only member of Congress on the Democratic side who opposed it, and Russ Feingold. Everybody else, 99.9% of members of Congress, they just gave a rubber stamp to the government saying, we're in a time of war. We have to rally around the flag and rally around our war president. Okay, Tal, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's not just that the governments are probably are not gonna give up powers once they have it. I think it also, society gets so used to just giving information away, and if government does it slowly enough, our perception of how bad that actually is sort of diminishing. So if they're gonna start by surveilling just phone numbers, and then they're gonna say, okay, we're gonna go into emails now, people might say, okay, they're already looking at my phone calls, they might as well look at my emails. I don't think it's worse than that, and people don't see it as that much of an issue anymore, especially with social media and online shopping and stuff, when we're already willing to give so much information to so many other companies we don't even know who they are. If you have trust in the government or anything that's seem to have more of a, you tend to think they probably have your interest in mind. If you're already willing to give your information to outside companies for convenience, I don't think people are gonna fight stronger to have these not taken away from them now. So if there was not as much resistance before, I think it's only gonna be less moving forward.
Okay, Tal, thanks for those comments. And you are correct, with the prevalence of social media, people's expectation of privacy is, much less than what it used to be. And that's true. But, what Edward Snowden has revealed is that we're living in this massive surveillance state where, just about every aspect of our lives are gathered, put into the central database, and now the government could act on it. So when they decide to knock on your door because they think you are giving material support, which is a term of art in Patriot Act, you're giving material support to the enemy, guess what? You're going to be detained with no due process. So I think that's really where the rubber hits the road when it comes to these things. Let's go to Katie and then Steve.
So I agree with your comment, Thomas, about like expansion of powers. You have to be careful because it's harder, it's easier to expand them than it is to contract them. It's sort of like it's easier to put on weight than it is to lose weight, was a good analogy like that someone gave, like which way is it easier? But my kind of almost non sequitur comment about 9/11 would be an interesting person to learn about was Noor bin Laden. If you've read about her, like bin Laden's family, so I remember she felt like really bad for what bin Laden had done. And if you read about her, I think she even sent like it was in an apology letter. I'm not exactly sure. It's been a couple months since I've read on her, but not everybody in their family, even in bin Laden's family himself, is radicalized.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. And if I recall, I think she came out endorsing Donald Trump last year. So again, that made a huge, splash in the headlines. Okay, let's go to Steve and Ella.
Yeah, some of the points I was about to make have just been made, but I reacted when Tal mentioned social media. It's just interesting to speculate how differently this might have all played out had things like Facebook been around at that time. There may have been less unity, and the conspiracy theories might have come about quicker. But the idea that it was, the Bush or Israel or whoever was the cause. But it is interesting how the Patriot Act and things like that set the stage for the decreasing sense of the increased surveillance we now take as a matter of course, and the lack of concern for privacy, and that's sort of generations younger than mine seem to not have that expectation that my generation and previous had of, what's private and what's not to be divulged. It really did help set the stage for the kind of what we now see. Like Facebook is so oblivious to a lot of these issues, and the sort of default assumption that everything is public unless you specifically say otherwise. And I mean, these forces, it wasn't like the Patriot Act was the cause of this, but these have all converged in a way that we now have increasingly fewer liberties or expectations of privacy than we used to had maybe 30, 40 years ago. And this is now the norm.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think the notion of how these conspiracy theories fester, that's kind of interesting, because on one hand, conspiracy theories have been around since, pretty much dawn of humanity, I guess. People always have these theories about why certain things happen. But on the other hand, I think there's something very unique about what happened on 9/11, because, basically, there are these kind of the truthers who have these kind of, belief about how, government either let it happen or made it happen, or it's an inside job. And I think this really gave birth to a new generation of conspiracy theorists. Now, I know Ramsey made a connection earlier about 9/11 and how now we're in this kind of a pandemic and these conspiracy theories. On one hand, that's kind of like a very, kind of loose connection. But on the other hand, this kind of the pattern of conspiracy thinking that we've had, this is kind of the latest, version of what the conspiracy, minded world that we're living in. Because up until 9/11, there weren't like massive conspiracy theories. But then after 9/11, we've had, people who were the truthers, and then we had the Sandy Hook conspiracy theories, and then we've had conspiracy theories about the outcome of the 2016 elections, 2020 elections, and now the latest version is that conspiracy theories about the vaccines. So I think it's just a continuation, and I think 9/11 kind of propelled the next, the most recent version of it. And certainly, social media just helped it, go viral. So you kind of have this like a perfect, storm of the happening of 9/11, the truthers, and then how this gets perpetuated on social media. And, I think, once that genie's out of the bottle, I don't think we could ever put it back. And that is certainly, that makes our society very divisive. All right, let's go to Ella and then Andrew.
Hi, I'm just going to talk about the Patriot Act and my thoughts on it. I actually thought George Bush, when he signed it, in that time, it was really driven by the attack on the Pentagon, World Trade Center, September 11th. And with his level of authority and the position he was in, he was under or inside a pressure cooker. And I thought that was fine. His intention really was to target terrorists, and it was to unite and strengthen America by providing the appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. I know that it did allow governments to seek warrants to examine business records of suspects of terrorists, like credit cards. They could investigate apartment leases, library records, because I think at the time, business intelligence, they were looking at library records and using ways of the computers to communicate and exchange information. He himself, and I think his wife, even thought, okay, this is an invasion of privacy, but we have no choice. We have to find a way to govern, control, and especially the key thing was to monitor, because they have to tap in and get into, it is getting into privacy, but how else are you going to monitor and try to get a hold of actions of people planning or terrorists planning another attack on America.
All right, that's a good point. I mean, if you're the commander in chief, your number one job is to keep the country safe. So you would want all the tools at your disposal to keep the country safe. But the truth of the matter is, it's impossible to keep everybody safe. I mean, US is a large country, with, 330 million people. The idea that you're going to keep every single person safe, I think there's different ways to look at perception of risk when it comes to terrorism. Yeah, I'm not here to justify terrorism, but the truth of the matter is, if you look at the European countries or people who live in the Middle East, they have a different view. Is that, look, terrorism is just part of life. I mean, just look at Margaret Thatcher almost got killed because she was visiting Brighton, which is like a small, I guess, not Brighton, I'm sorry, she was visiting Northern Ireland. And the IRA members bombed the same building that she was staying in, so she almost got killed by terrorists. So my point is, I'm not justifying being susceptible to terrorism, but at the same time, that's just part of life. So then the point is to minimize your exposure to terrorism so that your everyday livelihood is not impacted. And I think the Bush administration, maybe they did have the right intentions. I'm not sure, I wasn't there. But I think their vision was very short-sighted. And I'll give you another example why. Because even before the passage of the Patriot Act, again, August 6, 2001, so this would have been like a month before 9/11, Bush received what's called a presidential daily briefing. It's a confidential report from his national security advisor. And guess what the presidential daily briefing said? Quote, bin Laden is determined to strike America in American soil. That was intelligence. Now, did they need some kind of a, special surveillance through the Patriot Act to get that? No, we already had that intelligence. I mean, folks working in the CIA and the national security apparatus, they have pretty good network of intelligence already. I'm just not sure that, giving more expansive role and authority is necessarily going to keep us safe, proportional to what they had before. So, I mean, it's not like we were kept in the dark. There was that intelligence, but for whatever reason, they decided to not act on that intelligence. And by the way,
I don't think they were that advanced, to be honest. Like, even in what Bush said when he was riding Air Force One and he was in the sky, their communications was down. Air Force One, the number one plane to protect the president at that time, he couldn't even make a phone call to his wife to see if she was safe. So even though intelligence and he had his presidential daily briefing, which he has daily, or he did have daily at the time, they can tell, okay, the problem with the intelligence is, and I believe this today, they're great at, okay, this is going to attack, but do they know how to prevent it? Do they know when? They can, that's and how. How, when, who. They didn't have all the information really on what day, and it's like a moving target. And I find it very difficult. You can have the information, okay, you're going to have an attack, okay, so should we terrify our American citizens knowing there's going to be an attack? I mean, sometimes, and it's called, you can pre-plan, you can pro-plan to prevent anything. You can have contingency plans, but then the attack happens. Then there's the post-planning. You look at all the mistakes that you could, and this is terrible, but you take the lives and the deaths that happened on September 11th, and then it's the aftermath that you look, what could we have done better? Sometimes the attacks and not being able to prevent them, you look at the mistakes, and that can be a preventative and action for the future. I don't think they had the intelligence or anything to really know September 11th at 9 a.m. was going to be the time and the Twin Towers.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I think what Ella is mentioning here kind of illustrates the frustration that people have with our intelligence apparatus. If you look at the 9/11 Commission report, one of the main criticisms was that, look, yes, there was intelligence, but how is that intelligence being communicated so that there's a proper action? And one of the recommendations made in the 9/11 Commission report is that you got to consolidate certain agencies. There's a lot of overlap. And it turns out that based on the commission, like the Blue Panel Commission report, a lot of these agencies were not speaking with each other. In fact, they were kind of competing against each other because these agencies all operate on fiscal budget from the federal government, and they wanted to outcompete each other so they could guarantee certain budgetary awards. So FBI did not communicate with CIA, who did not communicate with, I think back then it was called Immigration Naturalization Services. Now it's under USCIS. So one of the recommendations adopted from the 9/11 Commission report is that let's have this one umbrella of Department of Homeland Security. Whether if you agree with that or not, at least that kind of consolidated everything. There's a lot more intelligence sharing and gathering, and maybe that made it more efficient. But again, if you go to the 9/11 Commission report, there was a person by the name of Richard Clark. I think he was like a senior FBI, investigator. Ever since probably like May of 2001, he was running around the FBI headquarters saying that, quote, I was screaming to everybody, like my hair was on fire. There's gonna be an Al-Qaeda attack. I want the federal government to do something. And they tried to get Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor at the time. Richard Clark wanted to have some kind of like a face-to-face meeting with Condoleezza Rice. Guess what? That meeting never took place. So I think what Ella is illustrating here is that it's very frustrating when we have at least some scintilla of intelligence, and they should have done something about it. Now, that little nugget of information is not going to pinpoint to, okay, the attack's going to happen precisely on a certain date, at a certain time, at a certain location. But at least you want to give that tool to our defense people so that they could, find ways to prepare, have a contingency. We didn't have that. And that's one of the failings of what they found in the 9/11 Commission report. So anyway, but I think the system has gotten better. I guess it's evidenced by the fact that we haven't had another massive attack. But again, the question begs, do we still need the Patriot Act to maintain the same level of, relative, safety? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I think, yeah, but we have to amend it, definitely. Social media, we've given up our privacy by owning a phone, right? Everything, apps, everything is tracking us. It's called, they track us digitally. Unless you actually have a Linux phone or something, yeah, all of us, 99% of us are tracked. So we're so used to it. Yeah, I think the Patriot Act should still be, it should be more towards terrorists though. And if it's maybe some amendments, I don't know everything from it in detail, but yeah, I do believe that it had value and holds value, but it should be current to our times and pivoting to like maybe a different type of war, or maybe terrorists will change, right? There will be another attack. There will be another attack. It's just my thoughts. And I think that's what Bush had said. If we pull out of Afghanistan, yes, I don't agree in the 20 years of it, but he had every intention of doing the right thing. And for civilians who were innocent, women, healthcare, supplies, US did a lot. Britain did a lot, Japan did a lot, Italy, Germany, these guys helped out. I mean, they had the best intentions. They had to respond. Long term, I wouldn't have agreed with Tommy, what was his name? Tommy Franks, for the fourth phase of war. I wouldn't have agreed with that, trying to stabilize the country. But the intention of it was good.
Okay, fair point. Let's move on to other members. Andrew and then Arvind.
Yeah, so with the Patriot Act, I mean, it just shows that, at least in my eyes, it just doesn't make any sense to even have it. It just sounds like we just need to improve the system that's going on with the intelligence agency. I think even you, Thomas, mentioned that these people knew that an attack was going to happen, but no one didn't listen. I mean, at the long term, the only people who are going, once all this is done, the only people who are going to have severe effects from this are mostly citizens. And there is sort of like a snowball effect in which these people try to go more and more with the surveillance route. I know every year, I think usually there's some kind of bill called the SOPA Act or something like that, which is like the Stop Piracy Act, which is introduced by some kind of Republican that's been pretty much coming up every year. And luckily it gets knocked down, but they've been more sneaky about it in terms of trying to let it pass through. So in terms of that, I mean, it does allow the government to go more and more with the surveillance route. And if the issue is with surveillance, the only people who are going to pretty much get like the back end of that are, you know, citizens, especially activists or protesters, who will be pretty much at the mercy of law enforcement. So, I mean, in terms of this, and with pairing up the tech agents, the tech sector, these people can easily come up with ways to remove the components that are in these devices to make it safer for people, to make them feel like they're not being surveillanced. But no, they're not making these changes. So I don't think that the Patriot Act should be around. I think it just needs to be an improvement with the intelligence gathering agency, because this whole like Patriot Act thing and surveillance thing would just lead down to like a pretty bad slope to more terrible things to come against the citizenry. I mean, the citizens.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, two of the major monstrous legislations that came out of 9/11, Patriot Act, and then the other one is the authorization to use military force, the UMF. Both things are still around today. And I will dare you that no sitting member of Congress will ever come on the floor of Congress and say, it is time to repeal wholesale the authorization to use military force or Patriot Act. Why? Because there is still kind of a social stigma. If you do that, you're un-American. But you know, look, I mean, maybe it's time to have that debate. You know, the perception of risk is a lot different now than it was 20 years ago on 9/11. And some of these programs, perhaps they're kind of outdated, or they don't really meet the current risks that we're facing right now. But there's no will in Congress to really talk about that. Now, to be fair, certain provisions of Patriot Act did sunset, and they never revived it. So those are gone. But other aspects of the Patriot Act are still alive and well, especially when it comes to the surveillance part of it. Okay, let's see. We have Arvind. Go ahead.
Thanks, Thomas. Very interesting discussion. I just wanted to bring in a counter perspective to Ella's point that the Patriot Act is good. Two things. One is, first of all, with the Patriot Act, there is something called proportionality even here as the discussion is going on in the chat. So you have one terrorist doesn't guarantee give you the right to monitor 334 million Americans. So you have one terrorist, you try to find out where he is, you try to narrow down which area he's in, you maybe start monitoring that area. Maybe if it's a Muslim or a Christian, you target the church or the mosque he goes to, whatever. You have so many ways. And if you absolutely need to monitor 334 million Americans just to try to monitor one terrorist, that shows the kind of intelligence failing that you currently have. So I don't think it's necessary to monitor everybody. That's the first point, because Patriot Act gives you the power to monitor anybody and everybody. And the worst thing is you don't even need. So my point is that, Ella is making the point that we need this because how else are you going to monitor terrorist activity? We already have legal infrastructure available for monitoring terrorists. It's called a warrant. go to a judge, tell him that you're monitoring this person because you suspect them of illegal activities. No judge is going to deny you a warrant for a terrorism problem. But the problem with the Patriot Act is it creates a FISA court, the Federal Intelligence Agency's court, which is a special court, which is not even subject to judicial review or subject to Supreme Court overview. So the problem is now when the intelligence agencies have their own courts and those warrants are not subject to even secrecy laws, where normally when you have a warrant and you obviously when a judge releases a warrant on somebody, no newspaper is going to get access to that information. It's obviously going to be secret information. But we do have secrecy laws where after 20 years or after 40 years, those records are unsealed, and then the civilians are given access to the doings of their government 40 years earlier in order to see what we have done and uncover the mistakes and learn from our mistakes. So the FISA court is not even subject to those kind of secrecy acts, and you're creating a parallel legal infrastructure, which I think is absolutely not essential. And it's also about the gain that you're getting out of it. I think with the Snowden revelations, we found that the number of actual terrorist attacks stopped are almost zero. I mean, there's absolutely no justification that I've read in any respected journal that talks about how this particular Patriot Act was the key difference, where they couldn't get something done under normal law and they had to resort to the FISA law to get something done, and that is what prevented a terrorist attack. I don't see any case that has come out in the open. Maybe they're being secret about it, but at least it's not. I mean, I would have thought that if it was so essential to them, they would have broken the news to the people that, yeah, we prevented so many terrorist attacks because of this particular Patriot Act and FISA court provision. But nothing has happened on that front, and that's where I'm coming from, that it's not just about, and I take your point that, with the current technology, we our citizens are themselves giving up their privacy to private companies. But I still want to draw a distinction between willful giving up of your privacy to a company where you first of all have a choice, and the second part where you don't have a choice and it's a government that takes it by default. And the second thing is the control over your data. In a private company, you do have some privacy regulations where if you leave the service, you can ask for your data to be deleted, whereas that kind of provision is also not lacking within the government. And finally, I'll just point here to Snowden's revelation, for example, where the intelligence agencies are subjected to such lax oversight that maybe around 40,000 warrants were approved by the FISA courts, with only 3 of them being rejected. I mean, if you go to a normal judge and you ask for a warrant, there has to be some kind of judicial scrutiny to ask whether this kind of surveillance is warranted and legal. So if you look at the normal approval rates for a warrant, for a search warrant, for wiretap or anything like that, you will find the success rate to be more like 60% or 70%, or sometimes even 30 or 40%, depending on the jurisdiction. So you do have a huge number of requests that are being rejected, whereas with the FISA courts, the data and the statistics that have recently been I think they were revealed in the Snowden revelations as well as in the congressional testimony. There were only 3 of them that were rejected out of some 40,000 or 50,000 requests. So that shows you that these are like rubber stamp courts with no judicial overview. And I just think that if somebody is monitoring me, the very least they can do is be open about it and be legal about it, because illegal monitoring is what is happening right now. Because I think if you read the Snowden's book, you will understand that the only reason he actually became a whistleblower was he saw the director of CIA lie under congressional testimony. He lied in front of Congress, and he said that the intelligence agencies are not doing mass surveillance on Americans. That was an absolute lie. And even after he was found out to be lying, there was no consequence. He was not arrested. If you or I had gone to Congress and we had testified under oath and we had lied, we would be in jail for perjury for at least 10 years. But that's the power of these intelligence agencies, that he was not even held accountable for that. So that's where I'm saying that this is a slippery slope, and if we don't have an absolute necessity and overview and review of the powers of this Patriot Act, it's a dangerous thing, because private companies can take our data and just make profit. But a future government, I mean, let's just say Trump decided to cancel the 2020 elections, the data that he has on surveilling 330 million Americans could be used for the wrong reasons, and that's always a worrisome factor that is not there when it's just a private company. Thanks.
Wow, very impressive points. Thanks, Arvind. I wish I could respond to a lot of those points, but we just don't have time. But I will bring up one thing, because, look, these programs could start out with good intentions, as Ella said. And, in wake of what happened, especially on 9/11, you want the commander-in-chief to have the right tools. But these programs perpetuate, or they exist in perpetuity. So maybe it started out with good intentions, but eventually it's going to be used for wrong reasons. The reason why this should be troubling for all of us is that the definition of a terrorist could evolve too. So again, in the context of 9/11, when they're talking about terrorists, these were people who ultimately ended up in Guantanamo Bay, etc. Right? These kind of extremists. But they could make an argument later that, look, if you ever decide to criticize the government, you're a terrorist. I mean, who's to say that they're not going to redefine the term government and they're going to charge you with sedition, trying to overthrow the government? And you have to be careful, because maybe one of these days you're going to have a leader of the country who you disagree with, and they're going to have a very, very like a loose definition of what a terrorist is, and they could use that power to then say that you are giving material support to a terrorist organization, and therefore, they're going to, impose severe criminal penalties that into the process. So that's one thing you got to be careful with. I just want to move on to some other components or some other legacies of 9/11 besides Patriot Act. Two other things that came up. One is Guantanamo Bay. The other one is what's called this extrajudicial rendition. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. But does any of you want to comment on either or? The continuation of Gitmo and this notion of extrajudicial rendition? Anyone?
I can just comment on Guantanamo Bay, and it was unfortunate what happened there. And I thought it was right that Donald Rumsfeld stepped down and handed in his resignation. So I thought that was definitely what he needed to do.
Okay, but did Rumsfeld resign because Guantanamo Bay or something else? I bet it was for some other reason. Right?
I thought maybe it had to do with the mistreatment of the hostages that they had captured and then interrogated, unless I'm mistaken.
But that was not in Guantanamo Bay. That was in Iraq, Camp Liberty.
Was it? I'll go back to look.
Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq.
Oh, was it? Okay. So that was when he stepped down in association with that one, with that prison. You're confirming?
Yes, I'll post a link in the chat if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, I follow the era pretty closely. I don't think he resigned because of Guantanamo Bay. It wasn't some kind of like a conscientious objector kind of thing. I think what happened was by 2006, these wars were becoming very unpopular, and the Republicans were looking to lose their seats in Congress, and they needed to kind of change the game plan, and they needed to shuffle some of the personnel. So I believe Rumsfeld just kind of resigned because he was becoming more of a liability than an asset to the Bush administration. So I think it was more like on that angle than solely due to Guantanamo Bay. But speaking of, Gitmo itself, I mean, do you find that to be acceptable? Is it okay that we have an open air prison camp in some other country? Do you find the treatment of these detainees objectionable? Any thoughts on that?
Can you talk more about it? I don't know too much about that.
Well, it looks like Arvind, did you have your hand up? Or?
Yeah, I just want to say it's really sad that we've not been able to establish a legal basis within US borders for this kind of interrogation. And when it's, we are not able to develop a paradigm for interrogating people, which is in contravention to, which is at least in accordance with international law, that shows that, we are going outside the law to do something like this in Gitmo. And I think it's just politics that is preventing us from shutting it down, because a lot of presidents, including Obama, promised to shut down Gitmo once they came into power. It was part of the campaign slogan, but they kind of realized that any president who shuts down Gitmo and releases those prisoners, and then they become terrorists because they've been tortured in Abu Ghraib, and they go back and rejoin a terrorist organization. That president is just going to get tarred in the face for forever. I think that goes back to even Abu Ghraib. In Abu Ghraib, we had a lot of prisoners. One of them was Abu Baghdad al-Baghdadi, and he was the chief of the ISIS. So there's a lot of flack about how US overreacted to the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, and we released all the ISIS, all the Al-Qaeda prisoners who eventually went on to form ISIS. So these people are traumatized and tortured people. I think it's a political calculation that releasing them doesn't help anybody, because they're so traumatized now. Maybe many of them are beyond repair or beyond normalization, and it's almost inevitable that they would join a terrorist organization. So I think that's the cynical political calculation that is being made by not shutting down Guantanamo Bay, but it's hurting our image abroad. And I think absolutely other countries are using US double standards and illegal activities in Guantanamo to justify their kind of labeling America as a terrorist country. And I would also say that US already has some black site rendition sites in countries like maybe Lebanon or Yemen, or these kind of countries, where they're willing to turn a blind eye to anything illegal we do over there. So I don't think there's a real case or necessity for Gitmo that has to be made. We already do a lot of this in other countries, including in Germany, where we have a black site where that recently came into controversy, where the Germans tried to shut us down because they suspected us of using torture methods in interrogation there. So I think we already have a lot of international territory and international military bases and black site rendition sites. There is no clear case for Gitmo, except the fact that they were afraid that if we shut it down and these prisoners go back to join a terrorist organization, then that president bites the dust. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Arvind. Jane, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, in terms of Guantanamo Bay, I think it's actually quite appalling, and it's evil, and it's unethical to the extreme. I think it was created, I heard, specifically to find a place to imprison these terrorists outside of the United States, so that some of the torturing could take place outside of the, I guess, the laws of the United States. And Laura Poitras, for those who want to learn a little bit more about Guantanamo Bay, she made 3 documentaries kind of in connection to Guantanamo Bay and the prisoners there, with footage there, as well as people who work there, but also perspectives from those who are living in other countries and what they think of it. And I think what should be most appalling for us here in the United States is the way it compromises or violates our constitutional rights to the extreme, where these prisoners are there without, supposedly they have these military courts, and I don't come from a law background. So supposedly they have these military courts who have hearings, but we have these prisoners who are there for more than, I guess now like 20 years, who haven't really had hearings or any resolution to their hearings. And I can't imagine as a US citizen to be alleged of a crime and to not have the rights to a hearing. It just seems like it's one of the basic rights that the United States stands for and should be proud. And if we are supporting these policies or not speaking out about them, I think there's a lot to not be proud of.
Thanks, Jane. If I could just follow up to the points addressed by Jane and Arvind. First of all, we should start out by saying that most of the folks who are detained in Guantanamo Bay, they're bad actors. I mean, these aren't like, some innocent people that we just happen to pick up. Sure, there might be some innocent folks, but by and large, there's enough intelligence to show that these are bad actors. Now, does that justify what we do there? Well, that's up for debate, because usually what happens is when you pick up these bad actors in a traditional warfare, you would have the prisoners of war. They would be entitled to certain protections and rights under the Geneva Convention. But the colorful argument that the likes of Donald Rumsfeld and others made is that, look, this is not a conventional warfare. These are enemy combatants. They're not wearing a uniform. They're not fighting under a particular flag. You know, they don't have a leader that's like your conventional military general. They're just taking orders from, you know, some ragtag, you know, captain of their unit. So because of the unconventional nature of this warfare, they were labeled as enemy combatants, and they did not have any rights under the Geneva Convention. So they were subject to torture, and it's a pretty massive systemic torture that they suffered in the hands of those who detained them at Guantanamo Bay. I mean, waterboarding. I mean, it sounds pretty benign when you hear it, like waterboarding. Okay, that sounds like you're going surfing or something, right? No, waterboarding is when you know, go through like a experience of being suffocated and you can't breathe anymore and you think your lungs are going to just collapse. And these people were subject to that repeatedly. There are things like sleep deprivation, and they would blast, you know, loud music 24/7 so that, you know, due to their weakened mental state, they want to gather some intelligence. Is that what America does? I mean, I don't know. If someone wants to justify that, feel free to speak out. But what I tell people always is, do we want our US troops to be subject to that kind of treatment? And I think most of you will say, no, that is not a humane way to treat any kind of, you know, soldier who is captured in war. You want them to be, you know, treated with the basic necessity and not be subject to torture. But unfortunately, that's the road that we went down on. And although these, you know, detainees, they don't have, you know, constitutional rights like a US citizen does, they do have some basic rights, you know, like the writ of habeas corpus. What is a writ of habeas corpus? That means at least you get to have your day in court and, you know, let the people that are detaining you explain why they are detaining you. But the US government said, oh, Guantanamo Bay, that's outside the purview of the US. A lot of the legal protections no longer apply because it's a foreign jurisdiction. And they tried to argue that the writ of habeas corpus did not apply. So again, you're just detained, you know, very, you know, subjectively, unilaterally, without any cause. You're not even told why you're detained, and you're stuck there for, you know, many years, tortured. That's certainly a stain, I think, in our country. And the fact that this still exists today, I think all of us should be very mortified. But anyway, let's go to Arvin and then Marty.
Sorry, just forgot one quick point I wanted to make. And Gitmo, I just want to point out that intelligence-wise, it has been a colossal failure. There has been very less. I think some part of the Osama hideout location was from a Gitmo prisoner, somewhat tangentially. But apart from that, there has been zero intelligence that has been useful or effective from the capture of so many prisoners and so many people for such extended periods of time. I just wanted to point out that it's absolutely useless, even from an intelligence perspective. And it's just politics that's keeping these people there on an extended period of time. Even intelligence officers are pretty outspoken in saying that there's very limited intelligence objectives to be met by having these prisoners and torturing them, which is now recognized as being an ineffective way of getting intelligence out of people, because everybody knows that when a person is tortured, he doesn't necessarily tell you the truth, but he just says something to stop the pain, and it could be anything that you want to hear rather than what is actually true. Because if you torture somebody and, you know, he actually doesn't know anything, but you still continue to torture him because you want something out of him, he'll just give you, make up some story, he'll just do anything, even if it's just to delay the torture from today to tomorrow. At least he has that extra one day to live. That's the way that your mind starts thinking when you're being tortured. So I just want to point out that the intelligence objectives that are being met by holding these people in gitmos nil to very, very extremely less, and there's multiple ways we could do this without doing that. Thanks.
Arvin, good point, but I might disagree with you slightly, because I'm sure out of, you know, thousands and thousands of incidents of torture, they might have collected some intelligence. they might have, thwarted some attack that we just don't know about. And sometimes when these, attacks are prevented, us as citizens or the public don't really know about it. So, based on the numbers of instances of torture, I mean, they might have gotten like a nugget or two of some useful information. Again, did that rise to the level of preventing or thwarting an attack? Maybe, maybe not. But again, I think the bigger,
Sorry, just a quick counterpoint. If that, I hope that is true, Thomas, because if for nothing else, just to be able to sleep at night so that our conscience can rest that, we did this for a reason. But if what you're saying is absolutely true, then we would find a lot more pushback from politicians who are campaigning to basically abolish Gitmo. They would be able to state that, you guys don't know about it, but I've read the intelligence reports and the Gitmo is actually serving a purpose. I don't see any politician taking that stance because they know that they're not able to defend that position that is saying that we are able to use Gitmo to prevent more terrorist attacks. So I don't see that coming out. If that was actually true, then I would see a lot more politicians at least coming out to us and saying maybe the public doesn't have access to this information, but Gitmo is actually useful and it is preventing terrorist attacks, because that's easy for them to do and they don't even need to justify it. They get access to the intelligence reports. We don't, not for another 40 years, and that too in a redacted form. So they can easily justify that to the public, but it's an absolute colossal failure and it's being recognized within the intelligence communities. That is why even the politicians have no ground to stand on when they say that, they want to perpetuate Gitmo. That's my personal take. Thanks.
Yeah, just one brief point and then we'll move on to Marty next. The closure of Gitmo has a little bit of, I don't know if you guys heard of the NIMBY mindset, not in my backyard. So basically, if you were to survey just some, like a random or, like a confidential, polling of these members of Congress, maybe they might agree to the idea of not having this facility in Cuba. But on the other hand, then what are you going to do with these thousands of detainees? Because there's a reason why they want to detain them. And I will guarantee you, no sitting member of Congress will say, yes, please bring that detention center into my backyard because our constituents will love it. No one's going to do that because it's going to be considered to be a public safety threat. So just like no, sitting members of Congress is going to say, please bring that nuclear waste facility into my home state because it's a big political liability. So I think that's why this closure of Gitmo has been, more of like a political theater. But anyway, let's go to Marty, then Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about waterboarding and torture in general. So when I first heard about the debate regarding waterboarding, my first response was, what's wrong with it? They did it to me. By they, I'm referring to the military, the American military. When I was in training, I was in an elite unit, and they did something to us called water harassment, which was essentially the same thing. They held you under the pool. Yeah, and it was damn scary. And you could quit anytime, but once you say I quit, you're out of the program. And being an elite unit, this is something that we all wanted in on. And it was frightening and it was very painful, not just the suffocation aspect, but literally I would see these balls of skin crawling up my leg, from all the tension and everything. And it was incredibly painful. But yeah, I think it's an important part of our military training. It ought to remain in there. And if it could be done to us, then certainly I think it could be done to prisoners. Does it work? So part of my military training was to go through a mock POW camp. And we also heard lectures at that time by actual prisoners who had been prisoners in Vietnam. And they said, yes, torture works. They said everybody thinks that they're not going to break, but the pain becomes so intense that you break, and you can't give false information, because when the pain is so incredible, the only thing in your head is what you know to be true. Your imagination goes on vacation. It's no longer there. Now I've heard others say that torture doesn't work. I would imagine they're not using the right kind of torture. I would also ask, does are there any circumstances when you would agree to torture? So, in a situation where there's a ticking time bomb, this guy planted a bomb, and you don't know where. It's going to go off in shortly, whatever the time frame might be. Do you give him a cup of coffee, offer him steak and eggs, or do you torture him? To find out where that bomb is. And in terms of how others treat us, I don't think, in Nazi POW camps or in Japanese POW camps, they ever said, gee, we know that Americans are treating our POWs nicely, so we'll do the same to theirs. I wish it worked like that, but I don't think it does. I know it doesn't. Okay, thank you.
Just one point, Marty. When we, I guess, equate to other countries that torture, I guess we kind of lose our moral leadership because, one, I guess, kind of the point about the U.S. pride has always been, we're the most humane country and we do not resort to some of the violent tactics. I remember when they invaded Iraq, the first thing they said is, we're going to topple Saddam and get rid of all his torture rooms because he was infamous for, torturing his opponents. And, we always, at least on public image, try to take the moral high ground by saying we don't torture. Even George W. Bush, when he was asked about, hey, do you torture? He said, we don't, because he said waterboarding is not torture. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but he said, because waterboarding is not torture, America does not torture. We're a compassionate country, is what he said, George Bush. Mm-hmm. So I think once we equate to, well, they do it to us, so we're going to do it to them. I think that's a very dangerous race to the bottom.
Sure. I think a lot could be said. I think I don't agree with W on too many things, but I think that's an interesting point he made because, when you're waterboarded, you're not, unless they screw up, you're not going to drown. They don't want you to drown. They want you to stay alive. And you're not going to have any after effects in terms of physicality. You have no broken limbs. Nothing has been electrocuted in you or anything like that. And you can walk away as a complete person. Emotionally scarred, frightened. Yeah. But that's the price you pay for withholding information.
Let's go to Sam, then Ramsey.
Yeah, Tom, I guess I would question sort of your assumption of the Guantanamo being filled with terrorists and what have you, because I can't quote a statistic as sort of conclusive as the one I quoted for Daniel Hale, providing evidence that 90% of the drone bombings were sort of collateral damage, but there were a lot of reports that said from other sort of serious people who have looked at it, and from older documentaries, that a lot of people who were imprisoned were just people who were accused of being back in Afghanistan, like you could just sort of turn somebody in and get a reward, and there was a lot of that going on. So that's. That I'm not sure about sort of everybody, like, or what percentage actually in Guantanamo was made out of terrorists. The other thing, I guess, talking about waterboarding is not the only type of torture, unfortunately, that's performed. I mean, we've seen pictures of Abu Ghraib's torture with dogs, or sort of like a incredibly sort of humiliating mental torture, sort of like the some of the most sadistic things that can be done to those people has been done there, and it's I don't know, it's an incredible stain on the legacy of this whole post 2001 era. It's just really. This kind of really leaves a very, very nasty feeling.
Yeah, it's a good point. Just two brief responses. You bring up a good point, Sam, about we don't know exactly to what the percentage of those who are detained in Guantanamo Bay, they're truly bad actors versus they just kind of got caught up in, being detained and they're completely innocent. And the problem with that is we don't have any data. There's no transparency. It's not like we have records of court proceedings from habeas corpus saying, okay, this person, was incorrectly detained. There's just no accountability. So, we are kind of kept in the dark. And again, we should remind ourselves, we don't want a system where you have one branch of government doing all these things without any kind of disclosure. Yes, certain aspects of military operations are confidential, but at the same time, us as citizens, we should have the right to at least make these, freedom of information requests and find out. The second thing about the unfortunate tortures in Abu Ghraib is that, by the way, they're also electrocuted too. So that's another tactic that they use against these detainees at Abu Ghraib. You have this war where the Bush administration had very difficult time recruiting, the good people to serve in the military. Yes, there are plenty of good people who served in the military, but because we did not have a draft, and because the war was becoming so unpopular, the vetting process and the screening process was not as robust when they sent these troops to Afghanistan. So if you look at people like Lindy England, who was that famous person with, a cigarette in her mouth and, kind of like, having like the big guard dog barking at one of the prisoners. These aren't the most, I guess, humane people with the proper training to understand that when you're occupying a foreign country, you have to at least, respect a certain human dignity. And a lot of these people are just probably like, barely graduated high school, doesn't have the appreciation of, foreign soil. And they just kind of went there as just kind of like a bunch of misfits. And they just, kind of run amok and do whatever they want. These were some of the people who ran the Abu Ghraib. So that's the unfortunate thing about when you have these wars. Again, I'm not saying we should have a draft, but at least do a better job vetting these people so that, this is not a blemish in America, unfortunately. All right, let's go to, let's see, Ramsey's next. Go ahead.
Hey, so I just kind of wanted to touch on the idea that that torture is very effective. I'm sorry, but that is very untrue. It's completely untrue. Your imagination doesn't take a vacation because of torture. In fact, actually, study after study, case after case has shown that actually torture is the opposite of effective. Torture actually entices and incentivizes this detainee to give you false information because they are willing to do anything to make the torture stop, whether that's giving you false information if they just don't know the information, or confirming what you're suspecting, even if they don't know if that's actually true or not. And what if you actually have bad information? What then? That's the point, is that torture is not an effective means of actually extracting reliable information. It's been shown time and time again, yeah, it's been, I don't care if that's what American POWs said, but like it's also been shown time and time again by actual studies carried out by military professionals. So what has been shown to be much, much, much more effective, is actually psychological techniques, building rapport, building relationships with detainees so that they can feel like they actually can trust you. That's the point, is like that. That is what has been shown to be much, 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 much more effective than torture. On the other hand, also this idea that, this idea that waterboarding is not torture is just utterly, ridiculous. The fact that George W. Bush went into that, he was obviously going off of the definition of torture given in the U memorandums, which is like, if for those who are unaware, John Yoo is a law professor at, I believe, UC Berkeley, who wrote a series of memorandums for the Bush administration, basically outlining what quote unquote qualified as torture for the purposes of enhanced interrogation techniques. And what he the conclusion he basically came to was that torture, it's only for torture if it induces bodily sensations akin to or the equivalent of total organ failure. That is utter crock. That is utter crock, and it's just a testament to how the moral and principled approach to actually conducting ourselves in a military setting declined under the Bush administration. So the dancing around, the idea that waterboarding is torture is, in my opinion, ridiculous. It 100% is torture, and torture is illegal under the Geneva Conventions, to which the US is a signatory. So I think that, what the Bush administration did, what they tried to qualify as torture, the fact that they tried to dance around qualifying waterboarding as torture shows that they were, ashamed of those actions. It just goes to show how much our morals and our principles really slipped during that era. And honestly, I'm saddened to see that people have forgotten that. People have now some more rosy picture of George W. Bush. I don't think he deserves that. He does not deserve that, in my opinion. Still speaking.
That's a good point, Ramsey. I think somebody in George W. Bush administration would respond to what you just said by saying, look, we kept America safe. We did not have another attack on the American soil after 9/11. They're going to say, well, although these methods and what we did in Guantanamo Bay, yeah, you might object to it, but at least we did not have another attack. So if you were to use that, yeah.
Sorry, but then they also engendered a lot of resentment in the people that they were torturing, in the people that they were trying to get on their side. Like, they actually, in fact, torture is number one recruiting tool during that era for terrorist organizations who were trying to make the US out to be the villains. So they actually contributed to the perpetuation of these terrorist breeding grounds because they gave them a propaganda tool. So that is the danger. That's why there were such things as the Geneva Conventions, because they controlled conduct in the midst of war. Because, if you go to war, you agree to a certain set of codes. And when you don't live up to that standard, you are basically showing that you're not the good guys.
Right, that's a good point. And what you just said, Ramsey, kind of illustrates how, again, the U.S. policy is always very short-sighted. We're always looking at the next election cycle. So for the purposes of short-sightedness and for the next election cycle, it's perfectly plausible to say, look, I kept you safe, re-elect me. Very short-sightedness, very self-serving way. But if you look at it in a long-term way, Ramsey is absolutely right. We have just created a whole new generation of recruitment propaganda now. They're going to say, look what America is doing under its flag. And this is going to just, further be a propaganda to then recruit these next wave of extremists. And that's the component that we really did not pay attention to, because that's the long-term consequence. Again, whether if it's torture, drones, or these military escalations, unfortunately, the genie has left the bottle a long time ago, and there's just no way of undoing it. So, good point. Let's go to Arvin.
Thanks, Thomas. I just want to mention that, along with Ramsey's point, I would also bring in the counterpoint of, saying that you didn't have an attack like 9/11, so that means that my process is working doesn't mean anything, because 9/11 was unique in that before 9/11, our airport security was extremely weak. And I know this because being from India, we have extremely tight airport security. And it was so surprising that the US, you could walk right up to the plane without having any security check. And you could see off your friend at the airport door and walk up, right up to the steps of the aircraft and say bye to him and just walk back out without any kind of airport security. So I think it was just an accident waiting to happen. And the terrorists took advantage of that. Obviously, the terrorists always look for weak points and they strike where the security infrastructure is weak. So the next attack is not going to be of planes, coming in, blowing up to buildings like 9/11. It's going to be something else where our security infrastructure and our defense mechanisms are weak. And I accept that, gathering intelligence is one way to prevent terrorist attacks, but it's not the only way. We can always beef up our defense infrastructure and our security infrastructure, which we have done after 9/11. And I would point to that as being the source of, the saying that we didn't have an attack after 9/11. So, and remember, we've had other attacks where we've had lone bomb attack, gunman and lone bomb attacks by ISIS affiliates in nightclubs. So we don't call them attacks because they're not like the scale of 9/11 and they didn't bring down buildings. So that's, if you set the bar at every time to, 2 buildings crashing, and that's what is a terrorist attack, and anything else is not an attack on American soil, I think you're going to be very, very waiting for a long time for another attack. And that's going to happen where you least expect it, because they're not going to do another attack on the World Trade Center towers. So my point is also about, you raised the point that you're creating propaganda for the terrorists. That's true. And I'd also bring in the counterpoint. What if there is another attack after 5 years? You see, the slippery slope is now we're going to start doing the next level of this kind of interrogation. We're going to say, okay, let's make gitmos in all the 50 states, and let's have mini gitmos in all 50 states where extrajudicial torture is permitted, or, you bomb a new country because there's another attack on American soil. Or, I'm looking at that side of this aspect where we've already done this and we've pushed the envelope to this point. And now when we have another attack, what worse are we going to do? Because remember, the next president who is in power when another attack happens, he's going to be politically pressured to do something and to flex his muscles and show his machismo in the same way that Bush decided to show his machismo and bomb Afghanistan. So the next president is just going to take this further along, and we're going to see even more dystopian measures being introduced and our constitutional freedoms and rights being curtailed. And that's also the flip side of this, going to a place where the US law simply does not apply. So I just wanted to point to that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And in the most Machiavellian term, I don't know if you guys remember Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff to Obama. And I guess first week of his administration, Rahm Emanuel said, quote, "Never let a crisis go to waste. If you see a crisis, use it to your advantage." And to Arvind's point, yes, there will be a future US president. It doesn't matter which party it is. They will use that crisis to their advantage to further erode our protections, and also to further consolidate, the executive branch power. All right, we just have a few minutes left here. I know we've had a long discussion today, talked about a lot of different things. So why don't we just kind of wrap it up with any final thoughts, conclusions as we mark this 20th anniversary of 9/11. Any thoughts? Let's go with Marty first and Ramsey.
Okay, go back to the point I was trying to make in the beginning. You stopped me and said that we'd come back to it later. I'd like to finish that if I may.
Sure.
Okay, so because a lot of people came on since I first made that comment. I was referring to a comment that was made last time when somebody, well, to tie it into 9/11, I was talking about my first comment before many of you were present was regarding my fear that 9/11, because it was done by Arabs and people might blame our relationship with Israel and blame the Jews. And that was one of my concerns. And I segued into a comment that was made during our last meeting by the last person who spoke, who is present now, and she may have a chance to defend herself if she wishes. But she said that that the U.S. went to war during World War II to save Jews. And while there was racism in this country, well, the reason that she said it was she was making a case against getting involved in foreign affairs. And what really got me was that we went to war to save Jews, because there's absolutely zero truth in that. And I want to give some points regarding that. Number one, the U.S. began restricting immigration to the U.S. in the 1920s by country. So only 27,000 Germans of any religion were allowed in per year. And during the 1930s, literally hundreds of thousands of Jews wanted to come in, never mind 27,000. And of course, the U.S. said no. Hitler's persecution of Jews was done in a progressive manner, first with severe restrictions such as Jews can't have government jobs or go to public places and that kind of thing. Many countries spoke out against it, giving it lip service, oh, don't do that. And Hitler responded, well, which country thinks it doesn't have enough Jews? You can have ours. Well, there were no takers. And there's a great film that was made in the 1970s called Voyage of the Damned. And it's based on a true story where Hitler allowed approximately 1,000 Jews that you put them on a ship and see which country would take them in. And Cuba actually agreed to accept them. But by the time the ship arrived at the Cuban port, Cuba reneged. So the ship tried to enter the US waters by Florida, and the Coast Guard forced them out and wouldn't let them in, wouldn't let 1,000 Jews in. So to say that we went to war to save Jews, is beyond absurd. Then during the actual war, when the death camps were revealed during the war, the U.S. government was approached by Jews, asking them to bomb the railroads that go to the death camps, and just one bombing raid on the railroads would have wouldn't have stopped it, but it would have put a serious hamper on the amount of people killed, and the U.S. government refused to do so. They couldn't make one bombing run. Because they said we just had to vote, all our time to the other targets that they had in mind. So my point again, just being that no, the U.S. Did not go to war in World War II to save Jews. That's one of the oldest Jew-hating tropes around, that Jews caused all the wars, and it's because of the Jews that were in wars. Regarding Osama bin Laden, yes, he did tie in our relationship to Israel with why he did 9/11, but the real reason, and it was mentioned earlier, is that American bases were in Saudi Arabia. We were supporting the Saudi Arabian government. He was against the Saudi Arabian government. He's more extreme in his religious views. He didn't want American forces on his holy ground where Mecca and Medina are located. I think the only reason why he threw in the Arab-Israeli conflict was to gain more support among his fellow Arabs. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Marty. We just have a few minutes left, so let's try to wrap this up. I believe Amber has her hand up, and I'm not sure if that comment was directed to Amber, but if you want to respond, go ahead.
I'm not sure if that was a response to what I said, because it's not technically what I said. I said America going to war. Oh, actually, I can't. I'm probably going to paraphrase it, but my whole intention during that discussion was that America has this idea of itself that it's like the savior. That's why it projects domestically, but to the rest of the world, it's not something that we fall for. So going to World War II, when it was explained to Americans here, it was to get involved to revenge Pearl Harbor. That makes sense. But when it teaches history now in schools, it says it's because we cared about the Jewish plight and the Holocaust, and that's why we got into the war. But Hitler literally got the idea of the gas chamber from a Virginia congressperson. So the idea that America at that time cared about Jews, no, that I would never say that. We never even think that. But I was pointing out the fact that we were projecting that we're doing something good by going over there and helping with the Holocaust, while at the same time we had a segregated military. We went over there with a segregated military and said, hey, we're here to stop discrimination and racism against Jews and genocide and stuff like that, while we were doing the same thing to Black people. So I believe that was what my point was back at that point. But to tie it all together, we literally invaded another country and got the stamp of approval from the rest of the world because we said that we wanted to prevent it from being a terrorist breeding ground, and because we wanted to get Osama bin Laden for revenge. We could have done the same thing that was done later, many years later, with Obama, and sent in a tactical team to surgically remove bin Laden and kill him and be done with it. But we didn't. We made a big show of destroying a country that was smaller than us, not as rich as us, and not as represented on the world stage as we were. So no one felt sorry for Afghanistan when we went in there and we tore the place apart. No one came to their defense or anything like that. So we picked a fight with someone we knew couldn't fight back. And 20 years later, we're running away with our tails between our legs. So it's not a good look. That's all I can say. After 20 years, and Osama bin Laden being dead for a while at this point, and the fact that we did all this money and used all this money, this training, and giving all these weapons, and the place fell within a month, again, not a good look for us. So for the people who had died in 9/11, who you know, are true casualties of their government's bad acting around the world, they were not honored. The whole war was a waste of time and money, and it just served as an embarrassment to America. So that's my feelings on, you know, Afghanistan and 9/11. And I don't think America is steeped in reality. I think it's starting to believe its own lies. And we're now at the point where we really just, even if we wanted to do something nice, we just don't know how to do it. Nation building wouldn't have worked out because we don't know about Islamic culture or Arab culture. Heck, we don't even understand how to do it here in this country. So that's my last 2 cents about it.
Okay, thanks, Amber. And then Andrew.
Oh yeah. Yeah, really quick with ending things off. I think back towards the relationship with the Patriots Act and government surveillance. I think there's also a note of looking at other consequences with more of the corporate sector, and especially with the tech industry, in terms of how that winds up with the Patriots Act and surveillance. I think in terms of the tech industry, there should be more of a watchful eye and more of a hampering down in terms of giving more people's rights to do with their data, because I don't think having a contract saying pretty much, hey, you neither use our service or you don't, I think isn't a right way to go. I think it's kind of like a manufacturing consent, because it's neither, you know, you use our service or not. And I think more people should have more rights to do what they want to do with their data, especially when it comes to security risk in terms of these tech companies having everyone's data being pretty much wound up in one place. Easily hackers can gain through with the information and go and pretty much take people's data from these companies that have a huge gathering of these assets. So I think it takes into account to let's keep an eye on the government and make sure it doesn't get out of hand with surveillance along with these tech companies as well, because I think it goes hand in hand in terms of the whole Patriotism Act and the tech companies for capitalist interest along with government surveillance.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And then Ella for the final word.
I just did want to say, like, it's somewhat positive, but it's somewhat sad. Current day, Canada will be supporting about 20,000 Afghans refugees coming. So I think that's a good thing. And hopefully, I don't know, and I haven't heard if America will do the same, but this is the aftermath and this is the impact of US pulling out. So hopefully, I doubt we'll have the resources, but hopefully we can accommodate, and hopefully the 20,000 plus Afghans can try to find a comfortable place in Canada. And if US opens up their doors too, that would be wonderful.
Okay, thanks, Ella, for those words of optimism. I guess if there's no other comments, I'll just briefly mention that, you know, whenever we talk about 9/11, there's always that phrase, never forget, always gets invoked. And I think that that phrase has a different meaning to different people. We should certainly never forget those, you know, innocent people, American citizens who died, you know. I think there are like 2,980 or so that perished on that day. We should never forget that. We should also never forget the family members who had to grieve through all these years. That's certainly unfortunate. But we should also never forget what the US response was after 9/11. And I did post a link to that Watson Institute that kind of shows the human and economic cost of what the US did. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of innocent lives lost in the theater of war as a result of what happened on 9/11. We shouldn't forget about millions of people who were displaced involuntarily because of what happened after this war. I'm sorry, after what happened in the wake of 9/11. So, you know, as much as we want to honor those who sacrificed, as much as we want to honor those who, you know, died on this tragic day, we shouldn't do these things on the backs of those people and say, never forget. So one thing I'll say is, sure, we should never forget those, you know, heroic, you know, US soldiers who died and the innocent victims in the US. But one thing we should also think about is there should be no nostalgia for this period. And what I mean by nostalgia is the things that we talked about, you know, extrajudicial renditions, the tortures, the lack of, you know, writ of habeas corpus, the lack of constitutional guarantees. There should be no nostalgia for that. This is not like, you know, because I know some of you mentioned World War II. You know, there are some like nostalgia for like certain war efforts, and you know, during the Great Depression, you know, people who grew up in that generation, there is some nostalgia to that because there was this kind of shared sacrifice, and that kind of made up the collective, you know, psyche or the consciousness of America. I think this period is so much different. You know, what we did here in 9/11, it was something of our own choosing. You know, it was a war of choice. And all these programs that we enacted, you know, there's certainly some debate back and forth whether if that's necessary. But perhaps that now that we're turning the page from the 2 decades, you know, we could kind of look beyond this 9/11 era and not have any kind of like a nostalgic, you know, rose-colored glass view of what this period was like, because I think what this period showed is one of the darkest chapters of what America could do. And we really kind of lost our moral courage in this period. So who knows, maybe after, you know, this period, we could look forward and, you know, kind of be more, you know, have a more, you know, moral leadership. But certainly this period did not exude that. And, you know, this is not a partisan statement. This goes across the spectrum of all Republican and Democratic parties. So that's kind of my conclusion as we wrap up this period. So, but I do see some other hands. So I will allow both Arvind and Ella to quickly respond, and then I do need to wrap it up from there. So go ahead. Let's go with Ella first, and then Arvind.
Oh, I don't have my hand up. I just talked about the refugees.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Then let's go to Arvind. Go ahead.
I just want to quickly mention two things we didn't touch upon in today's very interesting discussion. Thanks, Thomas. One is we didn't talk about how the funding for the victims of 9/11, the compensation fund is drying up. And that's, we all agree politically that we need to compensate and give insurance and health insurance and for the firefighters and all those kinds of things. But the fund is running low, and we've had some protesters who were impacted and got cancer from working to look for survivors and clear the debris in 9/11, and their healthcare is running out. That's a political hot button issue, and that's being boggled down by procedural delays in funding that compensation fund. So I would try to highlight that issue in the public domain. And the second one is very interesting. Final note maybe is that we have now allowed Saudi to be sued for 9/11. So that's also an interesting tidbit. So we may see some victims suing Saudi Arabia for their involvement in either religious schools that were propagating Wahhabi Islam and violence, or direct funding of the terrorists through because 11 of the 14 9/11 terrorists were Saudi nationals. So that's going to be an interesting thing that we didn't talk about much, but I just want to throw that out there. Thanks.
Okay, great points, Arvind. I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we've got to leave it there. Thank you once again for joining us, especially on this very special day. Looks like the weather is pretty nice here in New York, so I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the weekend, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah.
This has been great.